Mr. Will, emergency surgery. A nurse came running into the surgeon's office. What happened? Someone was brought in by ambulance. Will was immediately alerted. No, it's a C-section. A woman's in labor. I don't think we're seeing anyone, Mr. Will said in confusion. A house call out of town. It's a remote village. You can't get in or out. They've got a paramedic station there, but they can't manage on their own, explained the nurse. Will leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples tensely. He had a rough idea of what he was talking about. Located in the northern regions of the country, their city was really the only island of civilization for the many worker settlements scattered in the forests. Well, not exactly forests, of course, but often not even normal tarmac roads led to them. You're the only surgeon on site. Would you be willing to help them now? The nurse asked. I could, of course. But then who would help them? Will shrugged. Call someone to take my place, and I'll go to the village. The car's ready. I don't like going to a rundown midwifery center. But what can I do, Will thought as he started to pack everything he needed. He always had a suitcase in his office for such occasions. Mr. Will, the roads are terrible. We'll have to take a helicopter, said the nurse. Oh well, the patient's health comes first, said the pilot. I'm on my way out, Will replied. And diving into the cockpit, he gave the wave and they took to the air. What happened? The pilot asked curiously. I thought we wouldn't have to fly this month. Yes, the patient is pregnant already. She can't give birth. Will shook his head, reading the brief history given to him by the nurse. Twins. Wow, what were they thinking? We should have gone into the hospital a month before the birth. Well, you know, not everyone can afford it. Maybe people didn't even have money to get to town. It's not rich people who live in these towns. These people have everything. Will dismissed it. You and I are on a special order today. Some local businessman called personally, asked the head doctor to allocate me. I don't know why it took so long then. My daughter's pregnant. My son-in-law can't find a place to live. Dad's got the whole region on his ear now. Did you think she could give birth on her own? We're living in the Middle Ages, aren't we? They decided to give birth in the forest. But I guess it wasn't meant to be. It's good that you are so noble you rushed straight to the rescue, grinned the pilot. By the way, I thought they had a midwifery station there. I've seen it, Will grimaced. A memory came back to him. They'd been there once before, but on a different occasion. It was many years ago, at the very dawn of his career, when rumors about the young surgeon had not yet had time to spread throughout the region. Why can't they do it themselves? Will had asked his mentor, whom he was supposed to be assisting. The medical car stopped near a ramshackle house with gray wood on the outside. Who's going to do the work? There are no specialists. One paramedic, not enough staff. Who would want to go to such a remote area to work on a permanent basis? Yeah, but at least we have some good equipment, Will said, even surprised, looking at the medical wealth hidden behind the doors. It's just a shame the instruments won't do the operation themselves. Father's good then. He lives in the village and keeps his family there, the pilot said, pulling Will out of his memories. The chief doctor said he wasn't happy about it himself. I was briefed him from head to toe before I left. He said he was a respectable patient. I was worried I hadn't sent my daughter to the center in time. I was afraid they wouldn't see to it. They'll do everything themselves. They did, and here she is before the operation. Well, and you were worried, Will said tiredly, handing the second baby in his arms. Oh, thank you. You're just a wizard, aren't you? Said Mr. Andrew, the businessman who had called the doctors to the village. The cesarean was just right. The babies are healthy and Mum just needs to rest and recover. Will nodded. No miracle, just sleight of hand. You shouldn't belittle yourself, Mr. Andrew exclaimed. You saved my daughter. He saved my daughter. That's worth a lot. I didn't ask for you to be sent here for nothing. The fame of the miracle surgeon has spread far beyond the city, and even to other states. Everyone knows about you, Will. Come on, give me credit, Will said, embarrassed. He was not accustomed to receiving honors, continuing to be a modest specialist, just doing his job. The main thing was that the patient was fine and the baby's health was intact. We're never really worried about being thanked and considered a magician. He had done surgeries and seen their consequences more than once. That's why he stopped being nervous or overjoyed a long time ago. "I owe you my life now," the businessman said suddenly, pulling some keys out of his pocket in front of everyone. "This is a present for you, the keys to a house in this village. Come here whenever you want, have a rest, live here. Nature is amazing. Fishing. You'll always be welcome. And I'll bring you back and give you a first-class holiday." "Come on," the surgeon waved his hands. "What gifts? I just did my job, for which I get a salary." "Don't refuse. It's from the bottom of my heart," Mr. Andrew insisted. "This house belongs to you now. I don't throw my word around." "Oh, come on. How can I accept such expensive things?" "Will, I insist." He embarrassedly accepted the keys and then put them in his pocket. It was useless to refuse a gift right now, staying in the emotions of his father and grandfather at the same time. He just wanted to express his gratitude for saving his daughter and grandchildren. "Maybe I really will come fishing someday," Will thought. "This place is really beautiful." Saying goodbye to his hosts, he left the midwife station and headed back to the helicopter. And the village was strangely enchanting, unfolding its beauty before his eyes. Everywhere he looked, there was a welcoming forest. The motorway stretched its cover to the horizon. Will felt a sense of peace as he looked at it all, feeling his soul in harmony with this place on the edge of the world. "Wonder were they sending you to the middle of nowhere again?" Emily, Will's wife, asked incredulously. "What can I do? It's the job," he shrugged. "You're traveling all over the region and they pay you a regular hospital wage," Emily grumbled unhappily. Will had no sooner crossed the threshold of the house than his wife immediately began to criticize him, expressing her dissatisfaction. "The salary is ordinary, but the patients are grateful," Will jokingly said, pulling out of his pocket the keys he'd been given. "What's this?" "A house in the country, but the nature there, just a delight. For the operation was a gift." Will tried to lighten the mood with a joke. "I wish you'd taken the money." Emily frowned even more. "Tell me, why do we need this wreck? And it's in the middle of nowhere. We can't sell it or rent it out. Even the owners didn't need it. So they sold it to you. And you're happy with it. Now you have to pay taxes on it, that's all." "What kind of a wreck is that?" "It's a normal house in good condition. Come and live in it. It's run by a local businessman. He's got a farm, big enterprise. So I thought I'd show my gratitude." "Oh, you're such a simpleton." Emily Will sighed heavily, not wanting to have any more useless arguments. Emily was always obsessed with money and only thought about how to get more of it. She was constantly dissatisfied, endlessly poisoning their family life with petty quarrels, complaints and attempts to make Will earn money from private services that paid many times more than his salary at the hospital. "Let's talk about this later. I'm very tired, I'm sleepy," Will said sadly. Sure. Everything's later with you. You're always tired." Would it do any good to be tired? Emily was unstoppable. So Will just walked past her and then disappeared into the bathroom. Will just wanted to wash off the hard day. After all, another tour of duty was coming up soon. "Listen, Will, why don't you take the day off today?" the doctor suddenly said as he entered the office. "Wow, that's generous. Who's going to be on call? Or will you bring Ben back from his day off?" Will said, remembering that his best friend and colleague was also planning to take the day off today. "No, why? They've sent us some trains. I'll leave Mr. Gregory with them. He'll keep an eye on them and take charge if there's any trouble." "Is it worth it?" Will asked doubtfully. "It's worth it. You're a valuable man. It wouldn't hurt to give you a day off," nodded the head doctor. "Go get some rest, or I may have to fly again tomorrow." "Well, thank you." It would have been foolish to refuse the generous offer any longer. Will changed his clothes, picked up his bag, and rushed home. Maybe he could surprise Emily and treat her to a romantic dinner. They hadn't spent many evenings together lately. Will was staying late at work more and more often, finishing urgent tasks. It doesn't take much to put a person in a good mood, he thought as he got off at his stop. All it takes is a sudden day off. The mood was really great. A lightness spread on his soul, which he had not felt for a long time. "Can I have a bouquet?" Will asked, stopping at the flower stand. What kind do you want? The saleswoman smiled. Just some roses, 7 of them. Will hurried to the entrance, climbed to the right floor, and opened the familiar flat door. I'm off today. Can you believe it? He said cheerfully. Will took off his jacket and wanted to hang it in its usual place, but suddenly he found someone else's coat there. Guests, Will wondered, looking at the man's shoes left in the hallway. Only now he realized that there was soft music playing in the flat and voices coming from the bedroom. And not just any voices. It couldn't be. He wanted to be wrong. Wanted what he'd heard to turn out to be, not what he thought it would be. Will strode into the room, swung the doors open, and saw. Will, what are you doing? Emily shrieked, trying to cover her nakedness with the sheet. Aren't you on duty? Said Ben, Will's best friend and work colleague. What are you guys doing here? Will flared up, clutching a bouquet of roses in his fist. Are you cheating on me? With him? Emily froze for a second. But after a moment, she glared angrily at her husband and even stopped covering herself. It's your own fault, she shrieked. Do you think it's easy to be alone all the time, without attention, without affection? I am not iron. You're a fool, Will shouted. He's a surgeon just like me. In the same hospital. Will, let's not be insulting, said Ben, who just pulled his trousers up. You shut up. You're my best mate. Will was seething with anger. He threw the flowers on the floor, feeling how stupid he looked standing in front of his lovers with them. At least he's promising. Soon he'll be transferred to a private medical center, and he'll be paid much more than you. Emily blurted out angrily. We've been dating for years. While you were traveling around your villages, I didn't want to have children with you, because I've been in love with someone else for a long time. Will retreated a step, feeling unbearable pain from the words of an unfaithful wife. All this time he dreamed of a normal family, but instead he received only a dirty betrayal. And this is after all I've done for us, Will thought sorrowfully, unable to utter a word. Let's not be silly, Ben said carefully. We're not going to fight tigers over a woman. I'm tired, Will whispered. No, you don't want to get your hands dirty over something like that, Emily said angrily. And she began to shout at Will, shouting insults, and even wanted to throw herself at her ex-husband. But Ben held her in place, ungrateful. I wasted my best years on you. I'd rather be with anyone than live with a loser like you. The insults came one after another. But Will wasn't listening. He just turned and walked away, not wanting to see the traitor again. I only married you because my parents insisted. They knew I shouldn't get involved with such a weakling. You can't even throw a proper scandal, was screaming somewhere in Emily's bedroom. Will threw the keys to the door right on the floor. He didn't even want to take the time to pack. His heart, shattered into 1,000 little pieces, shuddered painfully at the mere sight of what had become a haven for the traitor. I won't be able to use it anyway. I'd rather buy a new one, Will whispered in a colorless voice, leaving everything behind. He took only his jacket and his bag, which contained all his documents and some money. Don't you dare come back, Emily shouted after him, looking out of the bedroom, not bothering to cover herself, as if to provoke Will with her defiant look. Don't worry, I'm not coming back. I'm filing for divorce and hopefully I won't see you again, Will replied in an even voice, and he walked out the door, truly intending never to return to the place where he had been stabbed so cruelly in the back. And there was no energy to wait for the lift. Will walked down the stairs, feeling his consciousness sinking into an abyss of despair. The whole world, which he had so carefully collected all these years, had collapsed in an instant, leaving a confused Will among a pile of useless debris. So much for your day off, said the head doctor, looking at the letter of dismissal. What happened? Caught my wife cheating on me with my best mate. Will shrugged. I'm sorry. I can't stay in the clinic or the city any longer. It's disgusting. Okay, I understand. There's no other option. Why don't you just punch him in the face, teach his wife a lesson? It's a shame to lose such a specialist. But the head doctor did not argue further. He silently signed the application and let Will go, without even forcing him to work the prescribed period. Where am I supposed to go? muttered the former surgeon, sitting at the bus stop. Out of sight, out of mind. So, I think they say. And he just wanted to disappear, to go somewhere in the middle of nowhere, not to see the city. His hand slipped into his pocket, fumbling for the keys to the cottage in the country, once given by grateful businessmen. Maybe it was time to take advantage of the invitation. I didn't think you'd come to us with such news, Mr. Andrew shook his head. So there was no way out, Will said. Was it worth it to leave everything behind? Your career, your home, your beloved civilization? I'm not ambitious enough to worry about my career. Housing, civilization. I'll leave it to my wife. Are you generous? Mr. Andrew raised an eyebrow. More like stupid. Will leaned back in his chair, involuntarily recalling his recent conversation with Ben. Don't hang up, the former friend warned him, having finally reached Will from an unfamiliar number. Remember that thing with the missing medication? What do you care about them now? Will hissed, not wanting to talk to the traitor. I've got dirt on you, so don't be fooled. I'm serious, but I'm not getting married. I like being with her, though, so get out of town and don't let me or her see you. What else? Maybe you should keep the flat, too. You will, and you will. Otherwise, I'll report you for having a whole ample of accountable substances missing from your department. You'll not only get fired, you'll go to jail. Will, gritting his teeth, didn't understand how Ben had found out about one of the nurses' blunder. The medicine went missing by accident, not by malice aforethought. That's the only reason I didn't turn the nurse in, so she wouldn't be penalized for anything. Well done, hero. Except now the situation could come to light. And it's not just you who's going to get hurt. It's the nurse who made the mistake. So you're going to drop everything and leave. Yeah. Anyway, the village will welcome you with open arms, came Mr. Andrew's voice, bringing Will out of his dark memories. What lost? The former surgeon interjected. I'm saying we'll always need someone of that caliber. You'll get a job in our paramedic station. You'll be in charge. We will provide you with all the necessary means. We have no problems with them. We're just short of people. Thank you, Will said. So there'll be no trouble at all. The villagers will be glad to have a doctor around. It'll be quieter now. Especially as my friend and protege, Mr. Andrew, winked. You can't be kidding. We're supposed to be friends with people like that. Hello, son. You're as unreachable as the White House now, said Mrs. Torrey, Will's mum. What are you worried about, Mum? We spoke 2 days ago, he said with a tired smile. Of course I'm worried. That's why I've been calling a lot. My son has gone to the end of the world. Hey, if she had known that everything would end like this, she wouldn't have a foot in our house. Don't worry. You need to take care of your nerves. Will tried to distract his mother from the sad subject. How are you settling in? I'm settled. Mr. Andrew helped. The paramedic station where I work now, they've got everything I need. They gave me a good salary. It's a career move. Oh, I don't like you being in the middle of nowhere, said my mother. What wilderness is this? It's a whole village. Nature again. I go fishing, pick mushrooms. I am surprised myself, but I even like it here. I literally rest my soul. Can you imagine? Will replied. Oh, I don't know, son, I don't know. Maybe it's for the best. Chill out, clear your head. Just don't forget to call, cause I'm worried sick. Okay, bye, kisses. Will waited until she hung up and put the phone aside. The pain of being stabbed in the heart by an unfaithful wife had not yet subsided, but it was beginning to ease. Mr. Will, hello. Can I see you? Came the voice of the local gamekeeper. Of course, Samuel will come in, smiled at the surgeon. He had already spent some time in the village and had got to know almost all the locals. So the people here were quite friendly, and they were eager to establish relations with the only doctor in the neighborhood. Look, your help is needed, but the request will be a little strange, said Mr. Samuel. The elderly man wiped his feet on the mat and went inside. He sat down in a chair, fingering the hem of his jacket. He clearly didn't know how to start a conversation. Anyway, I found a wounded wolf here, said the gamekeeper. Wounded? Will asked interestedly. Yeah, they shot at him, but only wounded him in such a cowardly way that they didn't finish him off. I'd fix him up myself, but I can't get the bullet out. I need tools, an aesthetic, and practice. I'm just a laborer, not a doctor. You want me to do it? I know I'm used to treating people, but at its core, it's a living thing too. It's a shame it's just lying there, dying. Will leaned back in his chair, looking intently at Mr. Samuel. It was the first time he had ever made such a request, but it was not his policy to refuse to help a living creature. After a little gathering and wandering through the woods, they came to a small ravine, at the bottom of which the wounded animal lurked. "Well, look, there it is, lying there. Poor fellow," said Mr. Samuel. "Will it bite?" Will questioned the wolf doubtfully. "Yes, he's weak, and he knows me. Don't be afraid." Will went down behind the huntsman, laid out the tools he had brought with him, and then took a syringe of anesthetic. "Shall we get started?" Let me hold his head. Just in case," replied Mr. Samuel, stroking the wolf between the ears. The operation, strangely enough, was a success. In half an hour, Will had already started to put a bandage on the wound. The surgeon easily removed the bullet, treated the wound, and even put in a few stitches. All this time, the wolf lay meekly in their arms, only whimpering and twitching his tail tip restlessly. "Good boy, you'll be all right now," Will said, carefully tightening the knot in the bandage. "Thanks for your help," said Mr. Samuel. "As you can see, the poachers did their best. It's not even meat they're after, it's entertainment. They kill for fun, the bastards. If it wasn't for you, the animal would have died. I'll never forget your help." Will clapped the gamekeeper soothingly on the shoulder. "To wait," he said, "we did the right thing. There's nothing to be thankful for." After making sure that the wolf would be able to heal the remaining injuries on his own and leaving him some food, the men climbed out of the ravine and headed toward the house. "You know, I was thinking of killing it first," Mr. Samuel said, the way he looked at me. Honestly, like a human being, eyes so smart. I was startled. "So I thought I'd bother you." He noticed that he had soaked up the local color, that he even began to speak like the villagers. Having come here from despair, he found a real home, which not only sheltered the unhappy wanderer, but also began to gradually heal his ruined life. "Are you here to visit again?" Will said, noticing the gray silhouette on his property. The wolf muttered something in his own language and dropped the hair carcass from his teeth. "Thank you," Will thanked him, picking up the treat. The wolf sat up on his hind legs, nodded, and looked at his savior. It seemed to be thanking him for his help. The wolf had become a local landmark, thanks to the gamekeeper. Everyone already knew the story. No one was afraid of the wolf. He was allowed to run quietly through the streets. "I'm just going for mushrooms. Will you walk me?" Will turned to his gray acquaintance. The wolf muttered something again, shook his ears, and got up on his paws. Together they headed into the forest. The wolf ran about 5 meters ahead of them, and Will wandered behind, checking out the mushroom patches. "They've all been picked, it seems," he said frustratedly after an hour of wandering. "We should go further back, to the remote part. The locals don't seem to go there." The wolf seemed to have run off on his own. At least Will hadn't seen its gray back in a long time. It was nice in the forest, not yet cold and pleasant in autumn. It smelled of fallen leaves. "You don't see such beauty in the city," Will murmured, wandering along some barely visible path. He had gone quite far from the village, and only now he realized that he was beginning to get confused as the overgrown paths became lost in the grass and familiar landmarks disappeared. "I should have got so lost," he muttered restlessly to himself, spinning round and round on the spot. Suddenly there was a familiar grunt. He stopped, then was relieved to see his wolf nearby. "Hello, mate," Will said. "Will you take me home?" "I'm lost out here," the wolf mumbled something in response. "I'll take that as a yes, thank you. I'd probably be lost if I hadn't seen you." The wolf wagged his tail and ran forward. Will hurried after him, trying not to lose sight of the gray silhouette. "Hey, are we sure we're going the right way?" he shouted worriedly at the wolf. But the wolf continued to run along the path he alone knew. This part of the forest was completely unfamiliar to Will. If he had been alone, he would have preferred to go to some river, or he would have chosen a landmark, for example, by the sun. But in the company of the beast, he just decided to trust it. "What the hell is that?" Will said in surprise as he wandered through the bushes to a small clearing. After an hour of wandering, he and the wolf came to the wreckage of the downed helicopter. "Hey, is anyone there?" Will shouted, more for the sake of order. The crash had obviously happened a long time ago. The hull of the helicopter was rusted through. The area around it was overgrown with grass, and there was no sign of human presence anywhere. How long had it been since anyone had been here? Will said thoughtfully. Cautiously approaching the wrecked machine, he walked around the hulk, checked that the decking was not collapsing under his weight, and only then looked into the cabin. My God, Will couldn't help his exclamation when he saw the human remains on the front seat. The pilot? The experienced surgeon, though former, had often seen blood, trauma of all kinds, and even internal organs. But to be confronted with the mummified remains of a dead person like this was a first for Will. "Whose helicopter are you?" he said thoughtfully, looking at the interior. And of course it would be hard to find answers now, so many years later. It could have come from the mines, probably disappeared off the radar during an Emercom rescue mission. Mr. Gregory had said something about a plane crashing here many years ago. Will thought. There was no need to comment on anything, but his own voice soothed him. It also attracted the wolf so it wouldn't run away. It was actually kind of creepy to be out here, alone in the middle of an unfamiliar forest, next to a man who died years ago. Will remembered all the stories about ghosts and cursed places he knew. Every rustle made him turn round nervously, a cold sweat beading on his forehead. A chill ran down his spine. "What's that?" he whispered quietly, noticing the cellophane bag. Fighting his inner fears, Will reached out, dangerously close to the dead man, and carefully pulled a document out of a drawer. "Koa," he said as he ripped off the wrapping. It wasn't a piece of paper or an insert at all, but a real photograph of his young mother, standing in the arms of a man. "How is that even possible?" Will said with trembling lips. This was too much. He felt his fingers go numb and his heart race. A wolf grunted behind it. You're not a ghost yourself, are you?" Will whispered quietly, squinting at his great companion. The wolf snarled and licked the scar on his side from the surgery. "Okay, I get it, not a ghost," Will exhaled, trying to push away his superstitious fears. As a man of science, he had to always remain above any irrational fantasies. "The strangest thing is that I saw the same picture at home," Will said. Seemingly forgotten memories surfaced before his eyes. "Mum, who is that?" Will asked, twirling in his fingers a picture of a very young Mrs. Torrey standing in the company of a strange boy. "Oh, Will, don't shake those dusty albums," Mum fussed. "Are you hiding something?" said the son jokingly. "It's just something from the past. It doesn't mean anything. I'd forgotten I had it somewhere." "Well, tell me what kind of greeting it is." Will squinted his eyes in suspicion. "Leave me alone." "There's nothing to tell," Mum cut him off, taking the photograph from his hands. He hadn't noticed his mother's strange behavior that day. Every adult had a past that he didn't want to remember. "If I'd known I'd run into such a hell of a thing, I'd have asked for it." Will shook his head regretfully, returning his thoughts to reality. Well, it's time to get ready to head back. The sun's going down and visitors aren't welcome in this forest at night. The wolf grumbled in agreement. "Shall we go to the village or go somewhere else?" Since we're on an expedition, the wolf only twitched his ears and wandered back along the path. It took them several hours to get out of the forest. The journey had taken all Will's strength. He could barely move his legs. It was a shame he hadn't picked any mushrooms. If it hadn't been for the strange photo, it would have been a wasted day. "Mr. Samuel, I'm here to see you this time." "May I?" said Will, entering the gamekeeper's hut. Come in, dear. What have you come for?" said the elderly owner in a friendly tone. "Tea with raspberry jam. I made it myself. It's good this year." "Thank you, I wouldn't say no," Will nodded, sitting down at the table. "Remind me, when did you have a helicopter crash here? You told me about it once." "I did," Mr. Samuel replied, setting a mug of tea in front of his guest. "The rescue crews were flying in bad weather, I think. Their pilot was out of control. Have you heard anything more about that accident?" "No," the man shrugged his shoulders. "It's sad, but they crash every now and then. Again, nobody knows where it fell. Specialists searched and searched, but they didn't find anything." "I think I found it." Will unfolded the roll the huntsman had given him and began to look at the forest. Even though he was in Wolf's company, he still remembered where they were so he could tell the authorities. The deceased pilot should have been buried, and the property in the form of the crashed helicopter would be a good idea to hand over to the owners. We looked at the small clearing strewn with wreckage. "What the hell are you doing out there?" Mr. Samuel shook his head. "I was mushrooming. You've got all the mushrooms in the neighborhood." "And did you find a dead body in the pilot's seat?" "In the pilot's seat?" "Yes," exclaimed the gamekeeper, and even crossed himself. "Well, not a corpse, of course, a mummy. Remains. Many years have passed. Okay, I'll call the district now. We need to organize an expedition. Equipment." "Is there even a place to get through?" "It's an overgrown road, but I think you can make it." We sat for a while, watching the rangers fuss. The deed was done. Now the missing man would finally find peace. Everything seemed right, but there was still a mystery to the mystery. The photo he'd found was literally burning the inside of his jacket pocket. And although Will didn't want to disturb his elderly mother, he needed to find out the truth. "Mr. Samuel called from you," Will asked, waiting for the gamekeeper to calm down a little. "Yes, he did. Only I have long distance. Why?" Nothing. Will dialed a familiar number and listened to the ringing tone, wondering if he'd get his mother home in time. "Hello. Who is this?" Mrs. Torrey's voice came through. "It's me, Mum. Hi. I'm just calling from another number." "Oh, son, is something wrong?" "No, I'm fine. How are you doing? Are you healthy?" "I'm fine." Don't worry. Just tell me one thing." Mrs. Torrey lay silent, listening intently to her son's every word. "Just don't worry, okay? Do you remember that picture of you standing young with some man? Why are you suddenly talking about her?" Mother questioned me warily. "It's just a case. I found a helicopter that crashed. It's been lying there for a long time. Everyone has forgotten about it, but I came across it in the woods and found exactly the same picture of the dead pilot. It's a strange coincidence. Maybe you know him." There were soft sobs in the phone. Mom was trying to hold it together, but it seemed that the news of the pilot's death had upset her. "Is everything okay? What's wrong?" "My son. What happened? Did he crash?" "What are you worried about? That was years ago, not now." "Yes, you're right. It's been a long time." Mrs. Torrey sighed sorrowfully, unable to hold back her sobs. Mum, what happened? Do you know this man?" Will asked cautiously. "It was years ago. You see," Mrs. Torrey exclaimed again. "We had a fight." "With whom, Mum?" "Who was that man?" he asked, sensing something wrong. "It's a photograph. We made 2 copies. Me and your father." Will couldn't believe his ears, and at the same time he felt his heart skip a beat. Dad, Mum never talked about him and never liked to bring him up. He was absent from their lives. She preferred to pretend that he was, so as not to torment herself or little Will. "We had a big fight then." Mrs. Torrey continued her story. "Andrew, your father, was a hot-tempered man with a temper, and he went to work as a lifeguard in places with difficult conditions. Will vividly pictured his dad, driven by strange feelings, leaving the city and going to work in the wilderness to heal his wounded heart. Just like his son 20 years later. Completely unaware of each other, they repeated the same journey." "What happened then? Did you stop talking to each other?" the son asked, anticipating the answer. "I tried to find him, wrote letters, asked colleagues, but it was as if he disappeared." Now I can see where. Mrs. Torrey couldn't stand it any longer and began to cry even harder. Old wounds that had barely healed in her chest had reopened in her old age. So, suddenly bursting into her life with bitter memories, Will was afraid to disturb her, so as not to provoke a nervous attack. But he couldn't deny himself the truth, because the second conversation might not happen. "Why didn't you and Daddy get married?" he said quietly but insistently. "Andrew's parents were against it, son," answered his mother through her tears. "Why?" "He was from a wealthy family, the heir to an illustrious family name. His parents dreamed that their only offspring would follow in the footsteps of their ancestors, also go into business, increase the family capital. Apparently he wasn't that kind of man." "That's right. You two are even more alike than you think. Your dad always wanted to save people, just like you. That's why he joined the emergency services, even though I asked him to. Is that why you two fought? Yeah, I was afraid he'd die on one of his calls. I wanted to keep him safe, but in the end, I just pushed him into the arms of death. Will slumped his shoulders helplessly, realizing that in the abandoned clearing he had most likely found his own father's grave. The corpse at the pilot's seat was hard to identify. The remains were too heavily mummified, but no one else could simply have this ill-fated photograph. Why keep a picture of a woman you don't know? Son, I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I just couldn't, Mrs. Torrey sobbed. It's all right. I understand, Will said gravely. I'm sorry to make you remember all this. Take something to calm you down. I'm getting on your nerves with all this questioning. I will. You take care of yourself in there, okay? And let me know if you hear anything. Will said goodbye to his mom and hung up. His heart felt heavy. He'd never known his father, but he secretly hoped to meet him one day. It wasn't some sort of necessity. It was just a childhood fantasy that had been shattered today by the harsh reality. It felt empty. For the first time in his life, Will wanted to get drunk so he wouldn't feel anything. Will, I'm sorry if I accidentally overheard you talking, Mr. Samuel said quietly, sitting down next to him. I'm sorry. It's a family thing. Don't mind me. Yeah, it's not that. I know something's obviously wrong. What do you mean? Will Lil asked tiredly. Well, listen to this. There was only supposed to be one pilot in the helicopter cabin that day. How do you know? Will answered a little irritated. You said it was a long time ago, but the pilot at the base was our local guy. He disappeared after a while, by the way. They say he went to the city. He had no family or parents, so nobody looked hard enough to find him. What do you mean by that? Will exclaimed. That a member of the Ministry of Emergency Situations couldn't have been there, you know? Why not? Dad wasn't a pilot, was he? Right. So he wasn't at the helm of the helicopter. Will stared at the gamekeeper. The older man nodded confidently, showing that he was sure he meant what he said. So there more to come, Will thought, feeling a faint hope inside. How could he refuse so tempting an occasion to hope for a miracle? Suppose you are right, Mr. Samuel, Will said, careful not to spook his luck. But where would I look for my father? He was obviously in that helicopter, or at least had something to do with it. I can't tell you that. Try our neighborhood of Osser. Mr. Michael, you know him. He's a good guy. Thank you. Will thanked Will sincerely, shaking the gamekeeper's hand. What's in it for me? Mr. Samuel waved him off. I wish you well. Will walked out of the hut, excited and at the same time afraid of making a wrong move. Fate had teased him with the discovery, then taken away his hope, then brought it back again in the form of a ghostly chance to find traces of a man who had disappeared 20 years ago. A whole host of feelings were simmering in Will's head, and he had absolutely no idea how to deal with so many emotions at once. He just hoped he wouldn't be disappointed. He hoped he wouldn't be disappointed because the search was going to be difficult, and the outcome of it was going to ease his mind. So look, said Mr. Michael, flicking through the yellow pages. I've done my own little investigation as you asked. I'm sorry to interrupt your work, said Will. Come on, you're the doctor. You're kind of the authority in the village. And the authorities have to help each other out, winked the precinct. Anyway, look, I had to ask around, pull some old strings. In the end, I found out that in the district and the Ministry of Emergency Situations many years ago worked only one person. And so it was my father, Will asked incredulously. I don't know. There are no children listed in his personal papers. You have different surnames. The policeman spread his hands. Maybe there's a photograph of him. Will didn't give up hope. Alas, only an entry in his personal file. Their department had moved several times. Paperwork was moved back and forth. Half of them got lost. You know how messy the government can be. Yes, I know, Will shook his head grimly. It was the only thread that could unravel this tangle. If this trail breaks too, Will began. Don't be in a hurry. The precinct officer was quick to reassure him when he saw the look on his face. There's still an interesting moment in this investigation. What point? Questioned the doctor. The most interesting thing here is that this very man, who worked then in the Ministry of Emergency Situations, is none other than a well-known businessman and local benefactor, Mr. Andrew," said Mr. Michael. "Are you sure?" "It couldn't be more accurate. I've checked several times and came to a definite conclusion. But how could this happen? He's rich. He gave me a house. Why would someone like that ever work as a lifeguard? It pays a pittance. Not everyone is born with a silver spoon in their mouth. Some people have to start at the bottom, from simple laborers. Then they start their own business, make their own money. Ask him yourself." The policeman handed Will a cardboard folder with all the documents he had managed to collect during the investigation. "Mr. Andrew, how could he be involved in this?" The only hope left was to simply show the photograph found on the plane and see how the businessman reacted. "Hello, Mr. Andrew," Will said, entering the businessman's office. He, as always, was in a small administrative building of his firm. "Hi, come in. You are always welcome here," the businessman smiled. "I have a question for you, but do not consider it tactless." "What kind of question?" Mr. Andrew raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Believe me, it is very important to know why you quit your job in the Ministry of Emergency Situations many years ago, and what happened to that helicopter." "Do you have strange interests?" Mr. Andrew shook his head. "It's been so many years. The thing is, I found that helicopter in a man's body. Now I want to put things right." "Why?" "It's personal, but I promise you, at the end of your story, I'll tell you everything." "Well, it sounds like a serious matter for you, at least." Mr. Andrew shook his head. "After that helicopter crashed, we never found him. The pilot died either in the crash or in the woods. I was supposed to go with him that day, but I came down with a sore throat. I'd never been sick before, and I couldn't even get out of bed. So that's the only reason he went alone. I thought it was fate or else. A man warned me about this kind of thing. I'm a stubborn donkey." Mr. Andrew's gaze faded into sadness. He was evidently recalling some of the more unpleasant events of his life. Will became alert and strained his hearing. So he quit his job and went into business. "I did it all on my own. I had a knack for it, thanks to my parents and teachers when I didn't appreciate it. I started my own business. That's how I built up my own firm. I decided not to leave the Taiga, now that things were getting better. I raised this settlement, and there were 2.5 cripples here before." "What about your relatives? Have you been in touch with them?" "Yes, it's complicated." Mr. Andrew shook his head. "It was such a scandal when I left home. It's embarrassing to remember. I slammed the doors and I didn't think about the future at all. That's how everyone thought I was gone, except his parents." "But why didn't you try to contact anyone?" Will wondered. The doctor had already guessed the true reasons, but he wanted Mr. Andrew to tell everything himself, without prejudice, as in front of a stranger. "You see, it's like I've started a new life. I even took my new wife's name so the past wouldn't catch up with me. I thought if fate told me to do it, I should do it. Maybe such a decision seems strange now, but back then I was ashamed to go back. I couldn't admit I was a fool. And it turned out exactly as I'd been warned. Thank you for being honest, Mr. Andrew. One last question," Will said in a trembling voice. "Do you know this woman?" He took the photograph from his inside pocket with cold fingers and put it on the table in front of the businessman. "Of course, wait a minute. Where did you get this picture from? I mean, Yeah, it was in the helicopter I found. I left it there by accident. The pilot must have picked it up. Wanted to give it back. Probably couldn't." Will looked at Mr. Andrew. Everything was falling into place now. The businessman's reaction was too unambiguous. He hadn't even tried to deny that the photo had once belonged to him. 2 copies. One at my mum's, and the other, it turns out. I performed a case-in on my half-sister. Will spoke up, fully realizing what was happening. "Wait, but your last name is Smith." "Why?" "Exactly like her parents. So, Mrs. Torrey, your mom gave you a different surname at birth," Mr. Andrew said in a low voice. "But why?" "I can only assume it was because of my parents. They're rich people, obsessed with blood purity. As strange as that sounds in modern times, they wouldn't let them live in peace. They'd take the baby for themselves, or worse. That's why I took my wife's name, so they couldn't find me. But why didn't she write to me that she was pregnant?" "I did. I tried to find her, There was nowhere to go. She thought you were dead, too, so she couldn't find the end of it. Will shook his head sadly. I ended up growing up without a father and with the wrong surname for me under normal circumstances. That's why you didn't understand anything. Not even when you called me for help from the city. Can you imagine the coincidence? Asking my own son for help and not even knowing it. I'm sorry, Mr. Andrews said quietly. It wasn't your fault. Who could have guessed it would turn out like this? There was still an emptiness in his soul. Will rubbed the bridge of his nose tiredly, not knowing how to react to what had happened. He'd found his father, but the bitterness of the lost years they could have spent together left an unpleasant aftertaste. Maybe we can try to communicate somehow, Mr. Andrews said quietly. It was obvious they were thinking along the same lines. Of course, Will nodded. I didn't ask you last time. Where's your new wife? She died a long time ago. I've been raising my daughter Amanda on my own. Have you seen her? She's all taken care of now, 2 little ones. You've got to be kidding me. She and her son-in-law don't have time to sit down. Look, maybe then. I don't know. If you want to, you could invite your mom over. But you don't want to go yourself, I know. But she really wanted me to let you know as soon as it's clear. I think she deserves to see you alive so she can stop mourning. Sure, call her, have her come visit. He sighed, anticipating what a difficult conversation he was going to have with his mom. The whole situation continued to seem strange to him, but at least they still had a chance to forgive each other and maybe find some belated happiness. Better late than never. Hello, Mom, Will said that evening, dialing the home number. Yes, hello, son, came the sad voice in the receiver. How are you? I'm fine. I found Daddy. Oh, really, in the helicopter. But at least I'll have proper burial after all these years. He's alive. He wasn't there when he crashed. Only your picture was there, and that was an accident. How is he alive? Mrs. Torrey gasped on the other end of the line. Well, how? It's a confusing story, Will said, hastening to interrupt the inevitable series of questions. Come to us, and you can ask Mull about it yourself. Where am I going? It's inconvenient. It's convenient. Dad's inviting you, and you should see him anyway. He's already got his own life there, my mother whispered into the phone. What's the point after all these years? But at least talk to each other. Forgive each other, so you can move on calmly. I need that for me too. I don't want my parents to continue living in a quarrel. Will urged his mother to come over. Will hung up the phone. His heart was beating a familiar rhythm, and autumn continued to fall on his soul. This crazy investigation had reunited his parents and allowed him to find his father. But the big picture wasn't fully coming together. It seemed to be worth rejoicing, but there was one more very important thing to complete, which Will didn't want to put on someone else's shoulders. Well, hello. He smiled as he greeted his mother. Here's our village. It's a nice place, and the people are kind. Son, I missed you so much. Mrs. Torrey threw herself into a hug. Me too, Mum, but you've got more important things to do than me. Will took her under his arms and led her to Mr. Andrews' house, who was already waiting for them on the porch. Hello, Torrey. The businessman said hello to Mr. Andrew. Will's mum froze, unable to believe that she was seeing the first love she had mourned years before. Well, there's no need to introduce you. You're not little kids. You two can talk to each other. I'll be going. Where to? Parents in one voice surprised interrogated. There's something I need to finish. Will turned and walked down the main street without listening to any objections. He had recently been notified as the only contact person in the helicopter crash case. Look, are you sure? Will questioned the precinct officer at the time. It's an unpleasant job. I can do it myself. I'm used to it. No, I'm the one who found it. I'm the one with the bad news. Not a bad bloke. They let him go a long time ago. They've had their grief. They've had their worries. Now they need to give him a proper burial. So it's a good thing. We'll walk slowly to the house of the dead pilot and check the address once again. The house stood a little aside, not far from the village. He knocked on the door. Excuse me, is this where the Swan family lives? Will said. Yes, what is your business? The girl asked, looking boldly at the visitor standing on the doorstep. You seem to be our new doctor. Anything wrong? No, not exactly. You see, here's the thing. Mr. Peter Swan was your father, wasn't he? Yes, but he disappeared when I was very young, nodded. She was pretty with big eyes and a slender figure and hair the color of a raven's wing. Looking at her, Will felt himself blushing and struggled to find the words. The dead pilot's daughter was too pretty. So much so that even Will's worried heart pounded with renewed vigor. A familiar warmth spilled into his chest. I'm sorry to have to tell you that your dad, he died in a helicopter crash far out in the woods. But we found his body. Mr. Swan can now be given a full and proper burial. Mummy, what is it? A child's voice came from inside the house. Nothing, son. It's for me on business, she said in a trembling voice. I'm sorry to be like this, Will mumbled. It's all right. Come in and have some tea. Can you tell me what's going on? My name's Caroline. Will followed her into the house. He didn't know what to say in such cases, so he just told her exactly how he found the helicopter, what investigation followed. It's interesting. You and I both found fathers. One way or another, Caroline shook her head. At least yours is alive. Maybe I can let mine go now. They sat together for a while longer, gradually shifting from sad topics to casual conversation. Will even felt as if they'd known each other for a long time. At least, he wanted to keep in touch with Caroline, to help her in some way, to ease her suffering. What the hell was that? Will grumbled when he heard a strange scraping at the door. It sounded like someone was just clawing at the outside or trying to make a dig. There you go again, Will said, and swung the door open. Seeing the wolf on the threshold, he said, Did you miss me? Will grumbled restlessly. So much has happened. It would take me a long time to tell you. I found my father, met a girl. Will felt the color rise to his cheeks at those words. It had been a few weeks since he and Caroline had met. In that time, the young people had already met several times, gone for walks, and started to spend more and more time together. They felt comfortable talking to each other. Communication was easy, and sympathy is quite mutual. They didn't even want to break up. Like schoolboys, really, Caroline giggled when she returned with Will after another date. We can walk till dawn. It's a little cold, though. But I have a couple of warm jackets, smiled at the doctor. Don't talk. I have a baby at home, Caroline shook her head. And if you think I'm in any way embarrassed by Justin, I don't. Just give us time to figure things out, Caroline said quietly. She stepped almost close to Will and kissed him gently. Their sympathy was slowly growing into something more, and they didn't want to rush things at all. There were too many sad stories under their belt, too scared of their hearts. But one thing each of them knew for sure, this new relationship could turn out to be something truly special for them. The wolf interrupted Will's pleasant memories. What's wrong? You seem a little restless today. The predator spun around a few times, jumped up, and then ran up to Will. The furry mate grabbed him by the hem of his jacket and literally dragged him towards the forest. What's the matter? What's troubling you? Will exclaimed. There was another growl. Okay, I got it. I'm on it. Together they rushed through the forest, winding through wild paths. Soon Will, following the wolf, crossed the familiar part of the forest and headed for the hunting grounds. Help, came a child's voice from behind the bushes. I'm here. So what happened? Replied the doctor, Uncle Help. My leg is stuck, came the cry of Justin, Caroline's son. How did you get here? Will ran up to the child and only now noticed the poacher's trap. A steel teeth sank into the boy's ankle, damaging the skin. The boy's lips turned white and he held on with all his might. It's all right. It's no big deal, Will said in a cheerful voice. We'll fix it. The surgeon gingerly gripped the halves of the trap, tensed and loosened the terrible trap. Oh, it hurts, exclaimed the boy. That's it. Now slowly. Will was frantically thinking about what help could be given now to avoid serious complications. And almost all the wounds looked serious. In addition, there seemed to be a shattered bone, and the boy couldn't even lean on the injured leg. Now look, this is called a tourniquet, Will said, putting a bandage on Justin's thigh. That's how you do it. And the blood started to trickle out of the wounds more slowly. Now we can treat them. Peroxide. Good thing he thought to bring a bag. Will thought, Justin, you're doing great. Now watch. I'm going to put you on my shoulder so I don't hurt your leg. And your job is to hold on so you don't fall, okay? Yes, I'll hold on, answered the boy. Good. Will carefully lifted the little patient and moved towards the village. The wolf had been running in circles around them the whole time, anxiously watching how their two-legged companions were doing. Will, my God, how could it be? Caroline ran into the paramedic station. Shay, don't panic, he replied. They've just landed a helicopter. They're going to take him into town and operate on him. Surgery, Caroline exclaimed. Yes, Justin was caught in a trap. What I was able to do on the ground I repaired, but the wounds are very serious. It's going to take some serious surgery. I just didn't risk doing it here. My poor boy, Caroline sobbed. The mother's heart clenched anxiously, afraid to even imagine what could have happened. Will watched sympathetically as Caroline paced the room. She wanted to rush to follow the helicopter, but realized that space was limited. How can he be in there alone? Caroline muttered. Don't worry, I've got some medical contacts. I know the head doctor there. Dad helped too, paid all the expenses, and booked us a car. We'll follow in a couple of hours. We'll be there by morning, when it should all be over. Caroline leaned into Will's shoulder. Her whole body trembled, but somehow she knew this man would be able to protect them. The thought of hurting the baby was too scary for her. But in her mind, she knew Justin was in good hands, so she decided to trust Will completely. How's it going in here? Will asked, walking into Caroline's house. It's like coming to work, she said, smiling. I can walk on my crutches, and I'll be running again soon. Justin's cheerful voice came from the room. Easy, fighter. Don't be in a hurry. You will definitely run, but not until the bones heal properly, Will smiled. The operation he had arranged for the boy had been a success. Thanks to Will's care, Justin was discharged in a couple of weeks with the condition that he would have a good rehabilitation under the doctor's supervision. Will was now really coming around every day after work, working with the boy. Are you doing all the exercises? Will asked. Sure, Justin replied. Come on, show me. Me. Only two, go ahead, and I'll make dinner, Caroline said. She came up behind him, put her arm around Will's shoulders, and kissed him on the cheek. The hardships they'd been through together had brought them closer together, and their sympathy had finally turned into true love. After class, we'll go for a walk, Will said slyly, turning to face Caroline, because a wolf needs company. Their lips met, but she was embarrassed, taking a step back. Justin will see, Caroline said, her eyes downcast. Kiss, kiss, kiss. I don't mind, came a boyish voice from the room. You see, Will smiled, looking into Caroline's beautiful eyes. He could feel all the worries receding here in the middle of the woods. Suddenly, the rebellious surgeon had found not only a home, a father, but true happiness. Couldn't resist an indecent proposal. MP4. Max was born in a rather poor family. His parents were not particularly happy about the appearance of the child, and therefore treated the boy very negatively. Since childhood, he had to endure various mockery, ridicule, and not only from the parents, but also from peers. And it began in kindergarten, where the boy first got acquainted with child cruelty. Max did not yet realize how difficult life is harsh in relation to a small defenseless child. He went to an ordinary kindergarten, but because of his appearance and unattractive appearance, he had no friends. And so one day, coming to the kindergarten, he saw the judgmental look of the teacher, and then heard. Why does he have to go to our kindergarten? We have normal children, and here they bring this one. How many times can you do this? He spoils the whole look of our kindergarten. He's the scum of the earth. The teacher's voice was rude and arrogant. She was talking to the nanny, not paying attention to the boy, who looked at her with incomprehension. Max continued to stare at the woman until she suddenly shifted her gaze to him, saying, Why are you staring at me? I'm ashamed to even let you into the group with the regular kids. It would be better if you were not brought to our kindergarten at all. She laughed and turned back to her partner, ignoring the tears in Max's eyes. The boy, though he didn't understand half of what was said, he still felt that he wasn't welcome. The strange pinching feeling inside was getting stronger and stronger. It seemed that the tears were about to start rolling down his cheeks in hot paths. But Max did his best to hold back the urge. For a few seconds he looked at the teacher, and then went to the group. Immediately the taunts from the children started coming in his direction. At 6 years old they were already quite cruel, and therefore did not miss the opportunity to tease the boy. No one liked him in the group, and he was well aware that the relationship would only worsen over the years. Max didn't want to go to school with these kids and continued to socialize closely after years of constant bullying. No one asks you what you want and don't want. My darling. Mrs. Olivia answered him sternly. She looked at the boy with distaste, holding the bottle in her hand. Clearly, she was not happy about talking to her son. She could see the unconcealed hatred and irritation in her eyes. You'll go to the school I tell you to go to. And if you suddenly don't like something, you can complain to your worthless father. He will arrange a sweet life for you. The woman clearly did not want to continue the conversation with Max. The boy looked worriedly at his mother for a few minutes, expecting her to say something else. But no, she remained silent, immersed in her own thoughts, and in the boy's mind the memories of the day when his family was irrevocably destroyed surfaced. Max had been picked up from daycare much earlier than usual that day. His mother was not in the best of spirits, and the boy didn't understand what was going on. But he didn't ask anything, didn't say anything, realizing perfectly well that this could be the cause of another mother's breakdown. He followed her silently, barely keeping up with the speed of her steps. At some point he stumbled, falling painfully to his knees, and at the same second his mother turned round sharply, saying in an irritated voice, "You're nothing but trouble." She didn't help the boy to get up, but only looked reproachfully at the way her son was rising from the concrete floor through the pain. Tears were running down Max's cheeks, but he did not make the slightest sound, knowing perfectly well that it could cause not the most pleasant consequences. He stood up and held out his mother's hand to go further, but she sharply pushed him away. The woman spoke through gritted teeth. "You're as worthless as your father. You can't do anything normal in this life. There's a reason I didn't want you. And if now it turns out that the neighbor told me the truth and your foolish father is cheating on me, together with him out of the house. Do you understand me?" The woman spoke with anger and hatred. She did not even try to hide her displeasure, looking at the boy with that reproachfulness that he became uncomfortable. Max, stunned, looked at his mother, not understanding at all what she meant, and why he and his father would have to go somewhere else out of the house. A few seconds passed like that, when Olga Pavlovna swiftly went in the direction of the house, leaving her bewildered son alone. After a while, the boy came to his senses and rushed after his mother. He had no idea what was waiting for him at home in a few minutes. Max entered the house at the moment when screams were already coming from behind the door. The boy froze at the door, not realizing what was happening. He only listened to the screams. "What the hell are you doing? Have you lost your mind?" Father Max shouted. "What makes you think that I can be at home not alone? Listen more to your crazy girlfriends who want to ruin our family happiness." In his voice it was heard that the man was very angry, clearly not going to calm down so easily. He continued to be indignant, as suddenly heard the displeased voice of Olga Pavlovna, who clearly was not going to leave the situation so easily. "What family happiness? What are you talking about? You and I are not even roommates. We live like strangers to each other. You don't love me at all. You don't appreciate me. How many times can you get on my nerves?" Afterwards, there was the sound of breaking glass. Max continued to stand still, hesitating to enter the house. The next second, the boy's father ran out of the house, holding his belongings in his hands. He looked completely confused. And the next moment, Olga Pavlovna ran out of the house, throwing things at her spouse. She screamed, and at that moment her eyes were filled with hatred and pain. "Get out of my house. I don't trust you. You're always giving me horns, and in front of my own child. Take him with you, and get out." Max looked fearfully at his mother. He didn't want to leave home, and he couldn't imagine that she had meant it when she threatened to kick him out. Until the last moment, he was sure his mother was just joking. "Do I need this kid? I'm not sure he's mine at all. She got him somewhere and now I have to raise him and be responsible for him. I've got nothing to do. You've been out. You're the one who's going to take care of him now." The man looked at Maxim reproachfully, then muttered something under his nose and went in the opposite direction from the house. He never looked back, never said anything more, and generally never appeared in little Max's life again. Mrs. Olivia took the loss of her spouse extremely hard, even though she had initiated the situation. From that moment on, the woman began to seek solace in strong drink and partly indeed found it. But only for little Max such changes in the usual way of life were extremely traumatic. Strangers constantly appeared in the house, spending evenings and often nights in the company of Mrs. Olivia. They often treated the boy badly, who looked at them with frightened eyes and often cried when he heard strange noises coming from his parents' room. He asked his mother many times when would Papa come back, when would they make peace. But time after time Mrs. Olivia looked scornfully at her son and answered in a haughty voice, "You have no father anymore, he has no use for you. If you don't like it, you can go to your father if you can find him," Mrs. Olivia shouted, throwing at her son Max a look of contempt that made him uncomfortable. Max squared his shoulders, trying to hide from his mother's reproachful gaze. But he couldn't. Mrs. Olivia was looking at her son with displeasure, and her gaze was growing heavier by the minute. "Why do you look at me as if you were seeing me for the first time? Go to your room before I kick you out of the house," she hissed. The boy shuddered and went swiftly to his room. He did not understand what was happening, but even then in his soul began to develop a dislike for his mother, which later turned into hatred. A few years passed. Max became more independent and determined. He was no longer afraid to say what he thought and could stand up for himself not only by force, but also by words. By the age of 12, Max knew how to put anyone in their place. During this period, communication with his mother almost ceased. He continued to live in her house because there was no choice, but tried not to cross paths with her. So stretched the gray everyday life, until one day Mrs. Olivia brought home John. It was a young man who literally groomed her. He showered her with compliments, cooked breakfast in bed, and spent all his free time with her. The woman was over the moon. Max, on the other hand, was quite puzzled. Something about this John seemed suspicious to him. He behaved too naively in front of his mother and not at all when she wasn't around. A few months after John's appearance, at night when Mrs. Olivia was fast asleep, Max overheard him talking to her. "Just be patient. We need that money. Soon she'll sign over her house to me, so I'll feel like a man here." Silence followed. Then John said irritably, "Stop bugging me every couple of days. How many times? I told you it's going to be fine. I'm in control of the situation and I know what I'm doing." Again the pause. Max tensed, trying to hear what was being said on the other end, but to no avail. The phone was not on speaker. "That boy won't do anything. He's a waste of space. She'll only listen to me, or I'll leave her. And then she'll come crawling back to me on her knees, begging me to come back. So don't worry, it'll all work out. She's already willing to do anything for me. Just a little more pressure, and she'll do whatever I say without thinking." Max couldn't believe what he was hearing. He knew John was in trouble, of course. But he could not have guessed that the situation was so bad. He stood in confusion for a while, and when John had finished talking, he rushed into the room. Anxious thoughts swarmed in his head. Should he tell his mother now, or was it better to wait until morning? But would she even believe it? Love often blinds one's eyes and prevents one from seeing the problem. Mrs. Olivia couldn't imagine how it would end. Waiting until morning was excruciatingly difficult. Max had had dozens of unpleasant thoughts during the night and concluded that his mother had to be rescued from such a relationship. But how to do it? After numerous considerations and internal arguments, the guy realized that the best option would be to simply tell everything as it is. But such a reaction from his mother he could not imagine. "How dare you try to ruin my family happiness again?" Mrs. Olivia shouted at her own son, not believing everything he said. Max tried to convey all the details of the conversation, John's mood and voice. But the more small moments in the story, the more irritated Mrs. Olivia became. The woman looked at her son with displeasure and clearly did not want to admit that everything he said could be true. "You broke up my first marriage, and I won't let you ruin my happiness again. Stop these weird surveillance games. Or I'll make sure you never live in this house again. Don't forget that you live with me, not me with you, and you have no right to tell me what to do." There was so much venom and resentment in every word that Max felt uncomfortable. He looked at his mother with anxiety and incomprehension, trying with all his might to hold back his emotions. But despite the inner torment and the cry of reason to keep silent, he still asked, "And why do you think that it was my fault that your family with your father broke up? You couldn't keep it together. You made up your own mind and then you threw him out of the door without even wanting to listen. You realized that you were wrong in that situation, and it was because of you that everything turned out like that." Max spoke calmly and confidently. He wasn't going to make excuses or apologize. In his 12 years, Max understood perfectly well what really happened at that moment. The boy looked at his mother carefully, realizing that he had caused her complete confusion with his answer. After a few moments, he added, "You don't need to try to blame me for your problems. You are an adult and should realize that all the consequences are your fault. They were adult decisions. You had to make decisions that will affect not only your life but mine as well. So I ask you not to blame me for something I had nothing to do with." Max noticed that with each new phrase, his mother's gaze became more and more heavy, so he decided to keep silent so as not to inflame the situation. But all that had been said was enough to make the woman furious. "How dare you speak to me like that?" Mrs. Olivia shouted at her son. "Have you forgotten where you belong? Have you lost your fear, or have you decided that you don't need a roof over your head anymore? I'll remind you where you are and whose money you live on." The woman came close to the boy, looking him in the eyes with hatred. Max didn't look away as he always did. He kept looking at his mother, realizing that he was tired of living the way she wanted him to and doing everything to please her and be a good son. The boy's gaze was frustrated and blank. He didn't know what else to say or do so that his mother would believe his words and not ruin her and his future through her own naivety and stupidity. "After you were born, your father and I had a bad relationship," Mrs. Olivia continued. "We didn't want you, but it was too late to do anything about it when I realized. Your father wanted a child, and I was a fool to agree to have you. I thought it would make our relationship stronger, but it did the exact opposite. I didn't want to see your father after you were discharged from the hospital. He didn't spend time with you. He was always at work, and he had no idea how hard it was for me. He didn't help, and he didn't bring in enough money to keep us from living in poverty. It's lucky I got this house from my parents. Otherwise, we wouldn't have survived that period. He also complained that I was getting cranky and tired. How could I be different with you? You were always shouting, not letting me sleep, not letting me sleep, not letting me eat in peace, constantly demanding attention, crying. If I didn't give it to you, you did things at home, as if to spite me. I hated you with all my heart and soul, but I believed that soon it would get easier. Then the neighbor called and told me that your father was cheating on me. You see, he was tired and told her that he just wanted to have a nice time as I was no longer so affectionate and attractive to him after you were born. All because of you, you know. And now you're going to tell me how to live and what to do. Because of you, my life is irrevocably ruined. You're the reason I'm where I am now. And you dared to destroy the fragile happiness that I finally had." The woman switched to screaming, clutching her son's shoulder hard, as if he was trying to escape from her. But Max continued to look at her calmly and seriously, waiting for the series of accusations and discontent to end. For a few minutes more, Mrs. Olivia expressed everything she thought. She wasn't shy in her expressions, and she wasn't afraid to hurt her own child. And Max, he was so accustomed to her rudeness and coldness that he paid no attention to the next attacks and threats. Finally, the woman was silent, closing her eyes and as if trying to control her emotions. All this time, the guy listened to her attentively and then answered, "You know, I did not ask you to give birth to me. I'm sorry that I made your life so unbearable, but there was nothing I could do about it. Don't worry. In a few years, I'll stop bothering you with my presence. But then you'll realize I was right about your new boyfriend. But it'll be too late." After these words, John turned round and went to his room. He didn't see any point in continuing the dialogue and didn't want to listen to his mother's accusations and displeasure. Mrs. Olivia did not listen to her son. It seemed to her that he was deliberately making all this up to get attention and make himself the only man in the house, but she couldn't imagine how it would end. It had been several days since John had last spoken to his mother. He no longer saw the point in trying to prove or open her eyes to reality. John, on the other hand, had been getting closer and closer to the woman all this time, showing her attention in every way possible and making her trust him as much as possible. The guy saw all this but decided to do nothing, letting the situation take its course. But he had no idea that his mother's mistake would affect his life too. One evening, when Mrs. Olivia was in a good mood, John decided to start his plan. The man looked at the woman carefully, trying to convey as much emotion as possible with his gaze. At that moment, Mrs. Olivia smiled smugly, saying, "Why are you looking at me like that? Do you like me?" She moved closer to the boy, looking at him intently. It was only a few seconds before John moved closer and spoke in his most satisfied voice, looking the woman straight in the eye. "How can a man not like you? I'm surprised no one else has ever courted you before. And why you chose me out of so many options. Although, admittedly, I would have chosen me if I were you. I'm just incredibly attractive," John said, moving closer to the woman. "That's why you love me, baby." He came close to her, looked into her eyes, and said in a satisfied voice, "I'm sure I'm also incredibly charming, aren't I?" John stopped a few centimeters from her face. Then he moved close to her ear, burning her skin with his hot breath, and whispered, "I wish I could marry you. I wish I could. You are so gorgeous, so desirable to me." He whispered compliments in the woman's ear, causing her to smile as broadly and sincerely as she had never smiled before. John had hinted several times that he wanted to make her his in every sense, wanted to build a family with her, become her official spouse, be with her always, no matter what. "So what's stopping you?" she asked. "If you want to marry me, you can do it. I'll marry you right now. I'll go to the registry office with you." Mrs. Olivia moved closer to the boy, looking intently into his eyes. There was so much determination and confidence in his gaze that for a second John was embarrassed. But he pulled himself together and spoke in a confident voice. "You know, I just can't feel like a complete man while I'm not on my own turf. But you know, these are the classic male hang-ups." He smiled, trying to make his words more casual. But Mrs. Olivia tensed. Her mind flashed back to the last conversation she'd had with her son Max, when he tried to say something about John's plans for her place. She pulled away from the man a little, and the man sensed something was amiss. His demeanor became sharper and his words more confident. "But that doesn't mean you have to do anything," Randy said to diffuse the situation. "I'm not forcing you to do anything. It's just a thought in your head, and you don't have to conform to it." "I'll love you without marriage," John said, moving closer, trying to ease the tension and create a more intimate setting. After a few minutes, looking intently into Mrs. Olivia's eyes, he added in a languid voice, "I just wanted to make you my wife." His lips gently touched the woman's skin, and she felt a pleasant tingling sensation. An electric current seemed to run through her skin, leaving an inexpressible sensation. Mrs. Olivia exhaled noisily, trying to keep it as quiet as possible. But whether from her relaxed state after a few drinks or because she liked the man so much, she couldn't resist. With her whole body pressed against him, she looked up at John and spoke in a languid voice. "What do you need to make me yours? What do you want from me?" The woman moved closer, looking intently into the eyes of her new suitor. She expected any answer other than what she heard from Randy. "I just want to feel like the boss in this house. How can I feel like one if this house doesn't belong to me?" He moved closer, burning Mrs. Olivia's skin with his breath, and thus forcing her to close her eyes. After a few seconds, he added, "You and I would be so good together if we lived in this house as husband and wife. Don't you think so? I would make you happy with gifts every day. And you and I would have had a girl, just like you wanted." John deliberately touched on subjects that were important to Mrs. Olivia. She had always wanted a daughter. The birth of a son had been an unpleasant surprise to her. She whispered with her eyes closed, "But we can be happy without a formal marriage, can't we? I'm sure we'll have a beautiful daughter anyway, and that we'll be fine as parents." The woman spoke with her eyes closed, trying to concentrate on her emotions. Suddenly, she felt John's scalding breath disappear. She opened her eyes and looked at him carefully. He was sitting a meter away from her with a perplexed expression on his face. He clearly hadn't expected such a response from a woman and was frantically thinking of what to say. But Mrs. Olivia was not confused and continued in a confident voice. "Why are you so surprised at my words? Can't people be happy without an official marriage? I don't think the state should interfere in our relationship. Besides, I've already had the unpleasant experience of marriage, and I don't intend to repeat it." Mrs. Olivia approached John, but he pulled away. The elaborate plan in John's head began to fall to pieces. He stared bewilderedly at the woman who was obviously speaking in complete seriousness. The silence was dragging on and becoming awkward. Mrs. Olivia's gaze was becoming tense. At that moment, John realized that he had to think of something. Suddenly, he said, "I just don't understand your train of thought a little bit. If you want a family, why shouldn't we formalize our relationship? I thought we were serious, and you wanted to spend the rest of your life with me." I could hear the disappointment in the man's voice. He looked at Mrs. Olivia in confusion, not knowing what to do in such a situation. There were all sorts of thoughts swarming in his head, and there seemed to be no right answer. John looked up at the woman and spoke in an uncertain voice. "What is our relationship, even for if you don't consider continuing it? What have we spent so much time building a bond of trust and such intimacy for?" John spoke seriously. The man seemed genuinely upset. Whether it was the alcohol or the strange pinching feeling inside, it seemed to Mrs. Olivia that he was telling the truth, that he really didn't understand what was going on. And for a moment she felt a pang of guilt for not trusting her young man from the beginning. She looked at John carefully, trying to understand his feelings. And after a few minutes she said, "Well, is it really that important to you? You never told me you wanted to start a family. It was the first time we'd ever had this conversation." The woman moved closer and looked into the man's eyes. She didn't understand why this topic had come up so acutely and suddenly in their relationship. "It's very important, you know." "Very important," John said. "You see, I was brought up to believe that I should build a family if I really love the woman I love. And I love you, and I would like to make our relationship legal soon." John was silent for a moment, as if considering what he should say next, and then he added, "But I was also taught that a man should be the master of the house. He should solve all the problems and provide for his woman. There is no problem with the latter, but with the former. I can't feel like a man when in fact I have no rights in that house. How do you see it?" He looked carefully at Mrs. Olivia, trying to make his look as sad and convincing as possible. There was silence again, but this time it lasted only a few seconds. "But I don't quite understand you," said Mrs. Olivia. "But if it's so important to you, all right, I'll sign you in at my house. Only it will take a little time." The woman smiled, looking at her chosen one carefully. "You can propose to me now. We'll start planning the wedding, and then I'll sign you up at my place. And we'll already have our relationship legalized, just like you wanted." Mrs. Olivia moved closer, noticing the slight twinkle in the man's eyes, but he tried not to show his concern. Smiling, the man nodded. Mrs. Olivia immediately relaxed, because she realized that her son's words were not true. No one had tried to take her house away from her. No one had claimed her property. What harm could come of her having someone register someone with her? It didn't give John any rights or opportunities, did it? But would she have known how the story would actually end, and how it would develop over the next couple of months? Max never spoke to his mother after their fight. He couldn't forgive her mistrust and constant judgment, and so he took the path of least resistance and cut off all communication completely. He tried not to cross paths with her at all, even in his own home. He left earlier, came back later. He completely ignored John's presence in the house, pretending that the man was not there. The boy was extremely puzzled the moment he found out about his mother's plans. He happened to overhear her conversation with her friend, which left him numb with shock. Had his mother really agreed to marry John? Did she no longer believe that her former spouse could return and their family could be complete again? Did she not see through his game and realize it would end badly? Despite all the excitement, indignation, and resentment, Max didn't talk to his mother about anything. He knew very well that it would once again come down to accusations and loud words, and he didn't want that. Let it be as it was. So it went on for almost 2 years. There was no offer, and the guy began to think that it was all just words to the wind. That John had just tried to pull a con, and at the moment when he realized he couldn't do it, he decided not to do anything to avoid losing the roof over his head. But it wasn't that simple. All these years John just thought up a new plan, still not deciding to implement it. At one point he even left Mrs. Olivia alone for a few weeks, but then returned for reasons unknown to Max. Max's life gradually began to improve. He started to work part-time, and then he had his first money of his own. Despite the unbearable desire to spend it, he started saving to move to the city in the future. It was not easy to combine work and study, and therefore Max began to skip school more and more often, giving preference to earnings. teachers could not ignore this. One day the guy was summoned to the director, and at that moment he realized that it would not be possible to turn away so easily. With a heavy heart, he entered the office. "Max, is everything okay with your family? You've been doing much worse in school lately, although that's not like you. You've always been a confident and determined guy. What's wrong with you now?" asked the headmistress, looking at the boy carefully. She pointed to a vacant chair and Max sat down in it. Taking a deep breath, he decided to say everything that was going on in his soul. He'd been wanting to talk it out for so long and had wanted to share all his problems with someone for so long. And since fate had it so that he had such an opportunity, he should not miss it. The monologue was long. The guy didn't miss a single moment that somehow or other occurred to him. He talked about John's conversation on the phone and all the doubts that had plagued him for the past 2 years, sharing his thoughts on the matter. After there were no more words left in Max's head, he fell silent, looking carefully at the headmistress. The woman clearly did not expect to hear so many revelations, and therefore sat in confusion. After a few dozen seconds of silence, she spoke up. "Is there anything I can do to help you solve the problem? Do you want me to talk to your mother about everything that's going on? I'm sure she'll listen to me. Or maybe you need some financial help. You realize that skipping school to work isn't the best solution. You have to get at least a high school education. Otherwise, you might have much bigger problems than talking to me." She looked at Max, who didn't seem at all surprised by her words. The guy looked at the woman carefully, and afterwards he spoke calmly. "Yes, I realize what the consequences may be, but if I don't work, I won't be able to put money aside. And as a consequence, I won't be able to leave my parents' house so easily in the future. I didn't plan to stay there past adulthood." He fell silent, looking at the headmistress intently. He had a brilliant idea in his head, which he decided to realize immediately. Making his gaze more serious, he asked, "Do you really want to help me, or are you just telling me this because you want to appear as a good person in my eyes?" "I really want to help you, Max. I am well aware that you are in a difficult position, and I can talk to your mother about the situation." "No, you don't need to talk to her." "I don't need that kind of help," Max said sharply, interrupting the woman. "If you really want to help me, make sure I don't get expelled from school. I don't know how to do it, but I'm sure you can influence my grades. I'm not asking for a B or an A. I just need to get my high school diploma. It's only 2 years away. I'm already in 10th grade." He looked at the headmistress carefully, trying to understand her emotions. For the first few seconds, the woman's gaze was heavy and completely incomprehensible. Max was already beginning to doubt that she would help, but suddenly the woman sighed heavily and without hesitation in her voice spoke. "Okay, I'll help you, but only on the condition that you devote at least some time to your studies. You can't not come at all, and you can't not study or do anything. The syllabus has to be fulfilled anyway, whether you like it or not. Only then can I negotiate with the teachers to treat you a little more loyally." She looked intently at the boy, who literally glowed at her words. He jumped up from his seat and began to thank the woman fervently. The headmistress smiled back, realizing how much she had made life easier for the guy who was already in a bad situation. "Max, just please don't do anything stupid. If you have any problems, just come to me. You don't have to try to figure it out on your own. You're not old enough yet, so I don't think you should take on such a serious responsibility." Okay, the boy nodded and thanked the woman once again, and left the office. From that moment on, the boy's life changed. He was treated much better at school. They didn't pick on him for petty things. Of course, he also fulfilled his part of the obligations and studied all the material as much as possible, and came to the exams afterwards. It seemed that life began to get better. Everything became calm, measured, as suddenly life threw up new tests even worse than all the previous ones. One evening, returning home, Max found a very unusual picture. In the living room was a huge number of guests who congratulated his mother on something. For a few seconds, stood in complete confusion. He decided to approach a familiar woman and ask what was going on. But the answer simply shocked him beyond belief. "So your mom's been proposed to. In a few weeks they will be married and become a full-fledged family." The woman smiled, obviously happy about this event. "To be honest, I didn't believe that this guy would make a move. but he pleasantly surprised me. I'm glad your mother was able to find someone. She continued to say something excitedly, but Max couldn't hear her anymore. He was looking intently at his mother, who really seemed happy. Really, is this how it's going to be? Is John really going to be his new father? Would their family really be one more person now? And is the wedding really going to happen? Or is this just another trick to gain his mother's trust? There were so many questions in the guy's head, but there were almost no answers. The situation seemed somehow unreal. There had been no change in the relationship in 2.5 years. John hadn't even moved fully into their house, despite numerous offers from Mrs. Olivia. And now? Now he had decided to propose to her and build a full family. Something about it all seemed illogical and wrong. But Max couldn't figure out what it was. A few days had passed since the proposal. Now John fully lived in their house, and therefore Max began to cross paths with him often. The man began to actively support Mrs. Olivia in her unhealthy hobby of trying alcoholic beverages. And therefore the guy saw him more and more often in a bad state. And so one evening, going into the kitchen, he once again encountered John. The man was in a completely drunken state. He looked up at the guy, and he was so cloudy and somehow gloomy that Max felt uncomfortable. He stared at the new member of the family for a few seconds, then mumbled, "Are you having a bad day? You look disgusting. It's like you've been unloading wagons all day, not living your life." But after John proposed to Olivia, he quit his old job, explaining that he wanted to spend more time with his fiancée. From that point on, he didn't work, which couldn't be said for the guy who had just returned from another shift in the fields. He looked at John with displeasure, but he seemed completely oblivious to his presence. Perhaps that was even better, because Max wasn't ready to talk to him as an equal. The guy walked in complete silence to the fridge to get something for dinner when suddenly he heard John's quiet voice. "You have no idea, kid, what's really going on in my life and in my head. I mean, you were born into a well-to-do family and you've never been denied anything. And instead I've had to make it on my own in life. Yes, I do it in a dishonest way. But this world isn't as easy as you might think. To achieve anything, you have to get around without getting caught in your dodgy dealings. At the same time, you always have to keep yourself in control, remain charming and attractive to all these women." You can't imagine how hard it is to control that. John sighed heavily, closing his eyes. Max stood silent, not understanding where such a harsh revelation in his words came from. But seeing a few bottles, he realized what had actually loosened the man's tongue. But should he continue this conversation? Should he even try to find out anything at all? After all, his mother would accuse him of lying again, even if he told her something. Should he even waste his time and energy on this? After thinking about the situation for a few seconds, Max said goodnight to John and left the kitchen. He saw no point in staying and listening to his fiancée's displeasure and problems with his mother. If he had stayed that night, his life might have turned out very differently. He would not blame himself in the future for not doing anything, for not listening to John at the moment of revelation, or for not even trying to do anything to stop him. But what's done is done, and the only thing left to do in the future is to take responsibility for the decisions he made and go through the trials with his head held high. The wedding of John and Mrs. Olivia still took place, despite the fact that Max was sure of the opposite. The newlyweds went on their honeymoon immediately after the ceremony. The guy stayed home alone, and no one called him to go together. But even if he had been called, he would have definitely refused such an offer. He did not want to spend time with his mother, and the opportunity to be alone seemed to him a kind of gift. If he had known that now he would never be able to communicate with his mother, never be able to talk to her, never be able to apologize to her for everything that had happened before. He had no idea how everything would really end and what such a seemingly innocent holiday trip would lead to. Max was at home when he heard the sound of the door opening. He looked at the time and the number on his phone. It was too early for a return from a wedding trip. His mother had planned to be back in at least 2 weeks, and it had only been 9 days. Holding his breath, he got out of bed, not realizing who could have been brought to his house at this hour. Suddenly, he remembered that he had left the front door unlocked, so anyone could have come in. He felt uneasy at the thought that a complete stranger could have come in. Could it be a burglar who decided to take advantage of the owner's departure, not knowing that someone else lived here? Or had John's associates decided to clean out the house in his absence so that no one would think anything of him? The thoughts in his head were not the most pleasant, and at some point in his head even flashed the desire not to go anywhere. But fear and interest made the guy still leave his room. He slowly headed towards the entrance, having no idea who he was about to meet. Cautiously peeking out from around the corner, Max froze in bewilderment. Standing on the threshold was John. He seemed somehow confused and lost. For a few seconds, the boy tried to figure out what was wrong. Then suddenly the realization came to him that his mother was not with her newly wedded spouse. He had returned alone and was now looking around, clearly trying to see if anyone was home. For a few seconds, Max watched his behavior. Afterwards, he decided to come around the corner. John stirred when he saw the guy and abruptly shifted his gaze to him. An uneasiness began to rise inside, which clearly did not bode well. Max looked at the man carefully, after which he asked him uncertainly, "Why did you come back alone? Weren't you supposed to come back with my mother together? You still have a few more days of paid holiday after all. Or has she already found someone better than you at the resort?" Max smiled wryly. Even in such a situation, he couldn't refuse to make fun of his mother's chosen one. But John did not react in any way to such barbed words. He continued to stare around confusedly, only occasionally returning his gaze to the boy. Something in his behavior seemed strange and suspicious. After a few seconds, Max added in an anxious voice, "What happened? Why did you come home alone? Where's your mother?" The boy looked at John for a few seconds, and then took out his phone and dialed his mother's number. After a few beeps, the voice of the answering machine was heard, notifying that the subscriber was out of range. Max stared at the phone for a few seconds with incomprehension. Then he raised an angry look at John. The guy grabbed the man by his t-shirt, pulling him to himself with force, after which he spoke in an irritated voice. "What the hell is going on? Where's my mom and why did you come home before her? When is she coming back? If I find out you've done anything to her, you won't live. I'm warning you nicely. You hear me?" Max shouted, unable to contain his emotions. He wasn't going to hold back in a situation like this. The irritation and resentment only grew stronger. John, on the other hand, continued to remain silent, looking at the guy with a blank and detached stare. Max felt his patience coming to an end. He shook John sharply, forcing him to look up, then spoke through gritted teeth. "If you don't tell me what the hell is going on right now, I'm going to find out for myself, and then you're definitely in trouble." There was so much rage and venom in every word that John shuddered. He shifted his gaze to the boy and then shook his head slowly from side to side. He covered his eyes, as if trying to cope with his emotions, and said nothing. He just collapsed in Max's arms, as if completely drained of strength. For the first few seconds, the guy held him in utter bewilderment, and then he unclenched his hands and spoke irritably. "What does all this mean? What do you mean, no? What do you mean?" John involuntarily raised his knee, as if trying to defend himself from Max's attacks. But the guy wasn't going to back down that easily. He squatted down. "If you don't tell me now where your mother is and what happened to her, you'll never speak again. You hear me?" There was a steely note in the guy's voice, and it made John really scared. He opened his eyes, trying to focus. Then, in a depressed, almost inaudible voice, he spoke only 3 words. "She's gone." Then he closed his eyes again, pulling his knees even higher and trying to calm the storm that was raging inside him. A tear trickled down the man's cheek, letting Max know he was serious. Confusion, pain, incomprehension all mixed together. An inexpressible feeling that simply couldn't be ignored. Fear rose higher and higher, making his heart beat faster and his legs shake. Max sank to his knees, staring at the floor, and thought for a few minutes about what he had heard. It seemed like some kind of evil joke that couldn't be true. It was only a few days ago, after all, that he had spoken to her, seen her smile. He had only seen freshly posted pictures on her social media the day before yesterday. "How can you do this? Are you messing with me?" the guy said irritably, rising sharply to his feet and hovering over John. "What have you done to your mother? Do you have any idea what I could do to you? Look at me when I'm talking to you." The guy abruptly turned John face up, yanking his hands away from his face. There was so much fear and terror in the man's eyes that it was simply impossible not to notice. Here is the edited text, taking into account your instructions. The uniformed men were rapidly approaching Max, who was looming over John. The look on the man's face was bad. For a moment, it even seemed to the guy that the man wasn't moving. But he wasn't. Immediately after Max was dragged away from the man, John promptly jumped to his feet, moving several meters away from where he had just been lying. He looked frightened and confused. The man's gaze was blank and directed somewhere past Max, who was looking at him with disdain. The guy was not going to accept the situation so easily, so he began to break out and shout, trying to continue what he had started. "Let go now. Him. It's his fault my mom's gone. I'm not going to leave him a happy and carefree life so easily. He must pay for what he's done. Let go." Max screamed and tried to break free of the police officer's grip, but he couldn't. The law enforcement officers looked at each other, shifting their gaze to John. It seemed to them that the man was completely out of his mind, whether he was so depressed by grief or under the influence of some strange drugs. After a few seconds of reflection, while continuing to hold the rambunctious Max, who kept trying to break free, one of the officers turned to his confused partner. "Here's the deal. I'm taking this one with me now." He pointed at Max, who had become a little calmer in his arms, as if he were gradually calming down. "You take the other one. Call for backup. We can't drive them in the same car. I'll see you back at the unit." Max felt his hands clenched tighter behind his back, and the next second they were cuffed. He turned at the policeman in bewilderment but said nothing, realizing that after what he had seen he was unlikely to be believed. He walked obediently to the car and turned one last time to look at John, who was staring in his direction. Then the door of the police car closed sharply in front of his face. Max was put in solitary confinement. They hadn't decided to put him in with anyone else, apparently worried that the problem might be the guy who just happened to be inadequate. He'd seen John being led past, and all requests to put them together had been refused. Perhaps it really was better this way. After all, Max was completely unsure of his own actions and powers. It seemed to him that he could do something terrible without any problems, and he would not regret it at all. So the guy sat all night behind bars. He did not sleep. In his head were the most unpleasant thoughts. But somewhere deep in his soul was the hope that it was all just a stupid joke which had nothing to do with reality. That John had really been on something, so he'd made up all the nonsense he'd said to him when he got home. That his mother had just found another suitor, and the man couldn't deal with it, determined to ruin her son's life. Outside the window, dawn broke. Max rose powerlessly from his bunk, feeling his entire body break incredibly from fatigue. He still couldn't bring himself to sleep without knowing what had happened to his mother. Unable to bear the unknown any longer, he started screaming, demanding to call a member of staff and tell him something. After a few minutes of shouting, at the moment when it began to seem that no one would come through, a stately man of age approached the cell. For a few seconds he looked at the prisoner in complete detachment, and then calmly said, "What kind of circus are you putting on here? You were told to wait for the trial. So you're going to sit and wait. No one's going to tell you anything just because you want to. We have no reliable information except that your mother's husband is under the influence of some strange drug. He'll come round shortly and we'll question him. Until then, I would ask that you behave according to the rules. Otherwise, we'll put you in solitary confinement, not at the station, but in prison, where you can scream all you want. I hope we understand each other." The man was about to leave when suddenly behind him came the excited voice of a boy. "What about my mother? Did you find out what that creep did to her? She hasn't been in touch." And he himself said that she was gone. Maxim involuntarily switched to shouting, but immediately stopped talking, seeing the man's displeased look. The employee came closer to him, sighing heavily, then spoke without a drop of irritation. "Son, I understand your emotions perfectly well. I too lost my mother early, but as of now, the guilt of the detained man has not been proved. We can't make any judgment until the investigation is complete. It could take a long time. If we prove his guilt, he'll go to jail. And if not, the man spread his hands, making it clear that in such a situation he would be completely powerless." A few seconds of tense silence passed when Max spoke through gritted teeth. "If it turns out that he's involved in this whole thing, I'll deal with him myself. He won't wait for real justice. I'll do it myself." The man heard the boy's words perfectly well, but did not answer him. He only sighed heavily and went back to his office, not wanting to continue such a difficult dialogue. It seemed to Max that time was dragging on endlessly. From time to time, he listened to the strange sounds that came from the depths of the building, but he could not understand what was going on there. At some point, his body just gave up, and the guy fell into a restless sleep. He kept turning round and could not bring himself to stop thinking about something bad. Several hours passed in this way, as suddenly someone's hand touched him. Max woke up abruptly on the bed. His eyes immediately met with the police officer who had come in the morning to his screams. The man looked completely distressed, looking down at the floor. He did not raise his eyes to the lad, though he could see perfectly well that he was looking at him anxiously. After a few seconds of tense silence, Max was the first to speak. "Well, did you manage to find out? You didn't just come to my cell to keep me company. Did he tell you anything? Did he tell you where my mother is and why she hasn't been in touch? What happened?" Max watched as the officer sighed heavily, closing his eyes. And then his heart skipped a beat. He realized that nothing good was going to be told to him, so he needed to start preparing for the worst right away. "What happened? Stop talking. This is bullying. Tell me what happened." Max started screaming. He was on edge, and he couldn't bring himself to stay calm, even when talking to a policeman. "I'm sorry, kid," the officer said, looking up at Max. "Your mother is really gone." The detained man said that they were relaxing on some beach when they were approached by locals. They offered to have a good time and buy strange cocktails. According to him, he immediately refused such an idea, but his wife insisted. He paid for them, after which they continued to admire the view. The cocktail seemed strange to him, and he refused to drink it. "But your mother said that she liked the taste very much, so she would finish the whole thing. Since her husband was against it, she took the second cocktail, took a few sips, and then returned to her drink." At some point, the detainee felt that something was wrong. The picture in front of his eyes became less clear. There was a strange feeling of the approaching end. He immediately jumped to his feet, but a sudden weakness made him sink to the floor. For a few seconds, everything swam before his eyes, and then he saw his wife falling before him in an unnatural pose. She whispered something about not being able to breathe. And then darkness. The officer was silent, as if he couldn't control his own emotions. He sat with his eyes closed for a few seconds, waiting for the boy to say something back. But Max remained silent. "The detainee claims that he doesn't remember anything else," the officer continued. "Only voices that appeared after the moment when the whole world went dark. They said something about not tolerating newcomers in their territories, and that this would be the case with anyone who came there. When the detainee woke up, he was already lying alone. No one was around, including his wife. We do not know how true this is, but such cases have indeed been recorded before. We've never been able to find anyone missing. I'm sorry." "They..." The officer turned to Max, who had hot tears running down his cheeks. He stared at the officer in disbelief, not understanding how this could have happened. After a few seconds, when there were no other emotions left inside the guy but pain and hatred, he jumped up, rushing towards the exit of the cell. The door was open, and therefore there was nothing to stop him from getting out of it. Max immediately rushed in the direction where John was supposed to be sitting, completely ignoring the cries behind him. He just wanted revenge. He wanted revenge for his mother. He wanted to tell John what he thought of him. And he didn't care at all about the consequences. Max had no trouble finding John in the other solitary confinement cell. He looked completely lost. It looked like the man had just lost his mind in the couple of days he'd been in this place. "I warned you that if anything happened, you'd be in trouble. Do you think I was joking with you?" Max rushed towards the bars, but John behind them didn't even flinch at such a sudden movement and loud sound. At that moment, an officer came up and started pulling the guy away, trying to calm Max down, but he wasn't going to leave it at that. Max struggled forward, trying to free himself from the clinging hands, realizing that he wouldn't get another chance. "Let me go. It was his fault she was gone. Why the hell would he go on living in peace after what he'd done?" Max tried to break free, but at that moment 2 more officers ran into the room. They easily stopped the guy, forcing him to sit on a chair that stood a couple of meters away from the bars. The officer who had been sitting with Max before squatted down beside him, looking into the guy's eyes. "Kid, listen to me carefully. It's not a good idea to try to get revenge on your own. You've got to realize that's not an option. You'll only jeopardize your future. We'll figure it out, and you don't have to get involved, okay?" The man looked at the boy carefully, not giving him a chance to shift his gaze to John behind the bars. "You need to think about what you've got to live and live on from here. And if you ruin your reputation now, it will be extremely difficult to restore it. Plus, you'll have a criminal record on your record forever. And no normal place will hire you to study or work. I promise you I'll handle this personally. But you have to promise me you'll stay out of it, okay?" The man continued to stare at Max until he nodded confidently. At that point, he let go of him, and rising to his feet, took a step back, turning to the prisoner who was now the accused. "Watch this one," he muttered carefully. "Don't let him do anything to himself until we know what's going on, and I'll ask you personally if anything happens to him. And with him." The man turned back to Max, who was staring emotionlessly at the floor in his chair. He sighed heavily and mouthed, "Something has to be worked out with him too. You can't just leave him in your ward. Besides, he's a minor. There could be some unpleasant consequences for our department for detaining him. We should let him go." The man nodded to his own thoughts and was about to leave when he heard the confused voice of another officer. The man nodded to his own thoughts and was about to leave when he heard the confused voice of another officer. "But if he's a minor, so we can't just let him go. He has no one at home and we have to hand him over to the child welfare authorities." The voice seemed confused. All eyes were suddenly on Max, who didn't care at all about what was going to happen to him next. He saw no point at all in continuing all these pointless negotiations. They were unpleasant to him. "So, call over there. But the kid's not supposed to be here tonight. Let me know how it turns out, where I can find him in the future." "Execute," said the man. After saying that, he walked out of the office, leaving Max with the other law enforcement officers. They called the child welfare authorities. After a short hearing, it was decided to temporarily take the boy to a place where minors without parents and guardians live. Max did not resist, just did what he was told. It seemed that there was nothing else left in the world that could please him or become for him a new meaning of life. But he couldn't even imagine how his life would turn out in the future, and how different a person he would be in just a few years. Max was left at the orphanage until the circumstances were clarified. He spent a few days there. Nothing was said or explained to him. These few days seemed to him a real hell. He didn't want to sleep, eat, or do anything. His only wish was to wake up from this nightmare that had come into his life. One day, the manager of the institution, Mrs. Kate, announced that Max would be diverted to an orphanage in a few days, as there was no one of legal capacity who had the right to take him without guardianship papers. They tried to ask Max about his father or other relatives, but he was reluctant to talk and expressed this reluctance vividly. He was well aware of what would happen to him next. He had acquaintances who grew up in orphanages, and, according to them, the conditions there were not the best, but rather terrible. To survive this period and not get a huge amount of moral and physical traumas is simply impossible. Therefore, the guy began to adjust himself to the fact that he would have to fight back hard and from the first day. There were only hours left before the departure, when an agitated, familiar voice sounded in the corridor. "How dare you not let me see him? I've done all the paperwork I need to do. I don't care if you're getting ready to leave. I have a right to take him out of here. I know exactly what the law allows me to do and what it doesn't. You have no right to stop me. Get out of the aisle." Max turned round, completely unaware of what was happening in the corridor. And at that moment, the headmistress of the school he attended burst into his room. She, looking around, confused and to some extent even frightened. But the moment her gaze fell on Max, she relaxed, smiling. Walking over to the boy's bed, she sat down on the very edge and spoke in an excited voice. "I promised you that I would help you in every possible way, that I wouldn't leave you in trouble, no matter what happened to you. As a matter of fact, I just found out about the tragedy a couple of days ago. I'm so sorry." The woman was silent for a few seconds, as if gathering her thoughts. Then she added, "I'm sorry I didn't talk to you about it beforehand. but I have decided to apply for custody of you. Of course, I believe that your mom will be found safe and sound. Maybe she'll come home soon and the guardianship is a temporary measure. And as soon as everything's okay, I'll give it up. I did it so they wouldn't take you to an orphanage. I don't think that's where you want to be." The woman looked at the boy in bewilderment, not realizing the emotion his face was expressing. There was confusion, pain, and relief mixed with tenderness and gratitude in his gaze. A few seconds passed as the woman added, "Of course, you can refuse my guardianship if you don't want to live with me. I'm not forcing you to. But just you don't think. You can choose how you want to live your life and what you want to do." The woman looked at the guy with undisguised worry. He was silent for a few seconds, and then he spoke in an uncertain voice, looking into the woman's eyes. "Thank you so much. I never imagined that you would be there for me in such a situation. Thank you." Max pressed himself sharply against the woman, trying to convey all the feelings and awe that were in his soul. He couldn't even imagine that life would turn this way after so many problems. After a tremendous amount of trials, some relief finally came. The guy felt his whole body start to beat a small shiver. After so many problems, after constant tension, after sleepless nights, after worrying and worrying about the future, he could finally relax. Finally, there is something good in his life, which he is extremely grateful for. Mrs. Isabella, that was the name of the headmistress who had decided to take Max in, spent a few more weeks getting used to a grown-up boy in her home. Sometimes she forgot that she had taken custody and that she didn't live alone. But Max was understanding. She didn't have to take him in. She only did it out of the kindness of her heart. After a couple of months, life returned to normal. Max went back to work and continued to go to school. Many people knew what had happened, but no one dared to talk to him about it. The wounds on his heart were too fresh to open. There was too much pain in the guy's eyes, which literally screamed that he should be left alone. The boy had successfully finished school, passed all the exams to get his certificate. There was never any information about his mother. The investigators stayed in touch throughout this long period of time, but never said anything encouraging. Max no longer believed that his mother would return, so he tried his best to move on with his life. He planned to go to another city, find a job, try to start life with a clean slate. But Mrs. Isabella, who for a long time supported the guy and stayed by his side in the darkest times, wanted a different future for him. One evening, she decided to talk about the lad's future and how she was willing to be involved in it. "That's out of the question. I don't want to keep spending your money. I'm old enough to start working on my own." Max became indignant after listening to his guardian's suggestions. Mrs. Isabella remained completely calm. She had no doubt that he wouldn't agree to her proposal right away, so she wasn't surprised by this reaction. But she didn't plan to back down so easily either. Waiting until the guy stopped expressing indignation and discontent, she spoke in a calm and confident voice, looking at him. "You know, I've always dreamed of having a child. For years I had imagined how he would grow up, how he would become in the future, a wonderful doctor who would help those in need. I was always sure that one day I would definitely become a mom, and my dream will come true, but..." The woman covered her eyes and sighed heavily. Max did not hurry, realizing that the topic was not the easiest for her. He looked at the woman in silence, waiting for her to continue talking. "But after my beloved Ben was gone, I just couldn't imagine being the wife of someone else. You see, I loved him so much that I couldn't feel anything like that for anyone else. I was sure the pain would go away eventually, and it did. But in its place there was nothing new. The emptiness kept me from feeling like a complete woman for years. It made me doubt the rightness of every decision I made. It seemed to me that I simply could not be a complete person without my beloved by my side, and that was just the way it was." She looked up at Max and smiled sincerely. That smile was so simple and sincere that the guy just couldn't take his eyes off her. "And then you appeared, and my life immediately became completely different. In some moments it even seemed to me that you really were my son, the one I've wanted so badly all these years. You're exactly how I imagined my own child to be. And that's why I can't afford to ruin my own future. God didn't give me children, but fate brought me together with you. And I'm sure everything in this world happens for a reason. It's either an experience or a reward for having it. I think it was a long-awaited gift that life gave me after so many problems and trials. Tears glistened in the corners of her eyes. She closed her eyes, trying to hold them back, but a lone tear was already rolling down her cheek. Let me realize my desires at least through you. I'm afraid that I will never again have the opportunity to be happy for someone who became practically a son to me the moment I received my diploma. This is my only wish. Please. The woman whispered the last words, and it sent shivers running down Max's back. He looked at her carefully, trying to overpower his feelings and still refuse, but he couldn't do it. After a few seconds, he replied in a quiet, almost inaudible voice, looking at Mrs. Isabella with gratitude. This is a small part of what I can do to thank you for your kindness and your care. He smiled. The woman opened her eyes, unable to believe her happiness. It seemed to her that even after such a frank confession, Max would still not agree to her proposal, that he would insist on independence and autonomy to the last. But no, he was looking at her with awe, and there were far more words of gratitude in his gaze than he could possibly say. Max had been thinking about where to apply for a long time. The exams were passed quite well, and therefore he had a lot of options where to try himself. But after the studied options and serious proposals, he decided to stop at the medical university. It seemed to him that since he had agreed to realize Mrs. Isabella's dream, he should do it to the full. The admission went well. Max was accepted to the free department, where he was to study for 5 years. Throughout this time, Mrs. Isabella promised to help the boy, and that's exactly what she did. She sent money, helped with non-core disciplines, and supported the guy in all his endeavors. All this together allowed Max to finish his studies perfectly and start his medical practice. To the surprise of many acquaintances, after a year of reflection, he chose the direction of gynecology. For some reason, it seemed to him one of the easiest and most profitable in terms of salary in the future. Without thinking for a long time, he decided to study to be a gynecologist, and in the future did not regret this decision a bit. By the time Max finished his university studies, Mrs. Isabella had turned 60. For the first few months, he thought about leaving for another city and starting to build a life from scratch. He had done everything in his power to thank the woman for her kindness. Well, now it was time to leave the old life in the past and try to become a really happy person. The boy was sure it would be easy to leave. After all, he'd wanted to for so long. But life is ordered in a completely different way, making it clear that his place is in this town and that he must stay here. And in the future, it will play an important role in the life of Max, who will still be able to become really happy. On the day of farewell, when the guy had already packed all his things and was preparing to leave for another city, something completely unforeseen happened. He was quietly folding the last t-shirts in his bag as Mrs. Isabella came into the room, and for a few minutes in complete silence looked at the guy, not daring to say anything. Max glanced at her several times but did not dare to start a dialogue either. Finally, at the moment when Mrs. Isabella was ready to leave, he asked, "Did you want something? You didn't just come to stand at the door, did you?" Max paused, looking at the woman intently. The woman turned round and smiled, replying, "I just wanted to tell you that I'm very proud of you, and that I'm going to be lonely without you in this house. I'm so used to having you in my life. It's just going to be hard to get used to you being an adult and on your own." The woman's smile grew sadder at that moment. She closed her eyes, trying to calm down and keep talking. "You know, you could have stayed in our town to be near us. Sure, you'd rent your own house or flat, and in the future you'd definitely buy something. That way we'd stay close, but you'd become quite independent." She looked at the guy with hope, but in his eyes there was only regret and sadness. It became clear that Max was not burning with the desire to continue living in this city. Nodding sadly a few times, the woman added, "I'm sorry, don't think I'm pressuring you. I just wanted to offer you an option. I'm sure you'll be a great professional." The woman closed her eyes abruptly. Breathing noisily, she slowly sank to the floor, clenching her eyelids tighter and trying to stop the strange, tugging pain. Max immediately ran over to her, not sure what he should do. Checking her pulse, he immediately dialed the ambulance number. "I'm fine. Don't worry, it's just age. It's just a few minutes now and I'll feel much better." "You see, everything will be fine," the woman mumbled, trying to calm Max down. But the guy knew perfectly well that there was nothing good in such a sharp pain and change of condition. And he was thinking about the worst. And that's exactly what happened. The ambulance took the woman to the hospital for examination and diagnosis. Max went with them to stay informed of everything that was going on. Half an hour later, a doctor Max knew from his time in practice came out of the room. He rubbed his eyes tiredly, then looked up at the guy and spoke in a tired voice. "Heart trouble. She'll need to be looked after. She asked me not to tell you what happened. So you can go to another city with peace of mind. But I can't do that. You know the problems people like that face. If you don't pay enough attention to them, the consequences can be bad." The man patted the boy on the shoulder, adding, "Of course, the decision is yours. I know very well that she's not your birth mother. But she did a lot to make you the person you are now." After these words, the doctor left, leaving Max in complete bewilderment. He stared at him in silence for a few seconds, then sighed heavily and went into the room. Mrs. Isabella was conscious. She was looking out of the window at the beautiful sunny day. Something in her appearance alarmed Max the moment he saw her. She immediately turned round at the sound of footsteps and smiled. "Why didn't you go home? I told you I'm fine. Just a little trouble, but it's okay now. You can go home in a few days." She smiled so sincerely that if Max didn't know the truth, he would probably believe her words. "You can keep packing. Just please say goodbye to me before you leave for another city. And don't forget to call me the moment you get there so I know you're okay." She spoke so calmly and judiciously that for a moment it even seemed to Max that everything was actually fine, and that the doctor had simply made a mistake. But the pallor and general soreness of her face said otherwise. He sighed heavily, sitting down next to Mrs. Isabella, and spoke in a calm voice. "I'll wait until you're discharged and then I'll think about moving. They'll wait for me in the new hospital, I'm sure of it." He smiled, trying to make the situation less tense. "Besides, how can I miss your birthday, which is next week? That would be completely unfair of me, wouldn't it?" He took the woman's hand in his own. They talked for a few hours, after which the guy went home. He had a difficult decision to make on which his future would depend. A few days later, Mrs. Isabella was indeed discharged home. The woman was standing in the street calling a taxi when Max came up to her with a bouquet of flowers. Surprised at his appearance, the woman spoke in a confused voice. "Weren't you going to go for an interview to get a job in another city? You might not be invited in the future because they think you are not responsible enough." The woman looked at Max with anxiety and incomprehension. He was completely calm and confident. "I've already passed the interview," Max said. "By the way, quite successfully. I have already been hired. Tomorrow I start my practice as a gynecologist." He smiled, noticing that the woman was immediately cheered by his words. She hugged the guy tightly, trying to convey all her warmth and affection with such a simple gesture. "I'll miss you, but I'm sure your life will be the best in the new city," Miss Isabella said. "You'll make new acquaintances, maybe even meet someone. I'd be glad if you could start your life as you've planned." And although at the last words the woman's voice trembled, she clung tighter to the guy, trying not to show her real mood, and began to breathe heavily, trying to cope with her feelings. Of course, Max noticed such a change in her state. He hugged the woman tighter to himself, after which he spoke out. "You won't have to miss me." He paused, clearly pleased with the woman's confusion, and at the moment when she was ready to be indignant and say something against this conviction, Max hastily added, "From tomorrow I begin practice in this hospital, while I will live with you, if you do not mind, of course. And then I'll think about how to organize my life. I don't want to make any big decisions yet." Mrs. Isabella stared at the boy for a few seconds in disbelief. She did not believe that he had really decided to stay and that she would not have to live her life alone. Max was glad that he was able to make happy the woman who was his only beacon in the most difficult period of his life. Yes, he didn't plan to stay in this town. Yes, he tried with all his might to leave it and do everything he could to start his life with a clean slate. But sometimes you have to think about more than just yourself. And this time he made a decision not in his favor. Many people knew Max since university. He showed excellent results and pleasantly communicated with patients. That's why at the moment when the appointment was announced, a queue was immediately lined up for him. A few months passed since the practice started. At some point, the guy started to notice that time after time a young girl, who had just turned 18, was signing up with him. She was checked every month, and sometimes twice a month, even though there was no need for it. Of course, Max accepted, listened, examined, despite the fact that he sincerely did not understand such an obsessive desire to control her health. Ashley, that was the name of the guy's regular patient, had made an appointment with him again, even though she'd been to see him only a couple of weeks ago. When he saw her appointment, he wasn't surprised at all, but smiled wryly. She was the last one to see him that day. So Max was already prepared for hours of questions about her health and how to choose the right partner, but he couldn't imagine how this next appointment would actually end and where his interest in the beautiful patient would lead. Ashley looked particularly attractive on this day. She wore a short dress, made an expressive makeup, and it seemed that she was going not to the doctor's office, but to a date where she was sure to please her chosen one. Sitting down on a chair near the doctor, she immediately noticed his interested look and smugly replied, Yes, I dressed like that today, especially for you. I see you liked my choice of outfit too, didn't you?" She, leaning on the table, looked at the man attentively and, catching his incomprehensible look, explained, "After all, you told me that you like it when girls dress expressively, that it gives them femininity and attractiveness in men's eyes. Remember, at the last reception. So I decided to take your advice to attract the attention of a man I like. And judging by your reaction, I'm doing just fine, didn't I?" Her gaze became more languid, more playful. She kept her gaze on Max, and he only mumbled, "I'm very flattered that you decided to make a good impression on me. And admittedly, you have succeeded. But I'm not interested in a relationship at work. I'm sorry, is something bothering you? Or are you just trying to show me how attractive you can be?" Max smiled, not realizing what the future held for him. He looked at the girl carefully as she leaned back in her chair. Ashley spoke in a confident voice. "You know, I was sure you were impossible to meet anywhere but the hospital. And I was right about that, wasn't I? I'd have to make an appointment to talk to you." So her gaze became more predatory again. She licked her lips in a languorous voice. "I'd like to invite you to my house. We could have a great time. You could get to know my inner world better." She looked at the man carefully, expecting a positive answer. For a few seconds, Max sat in confusion as Ashley suddenly added, "No serious relationship. Don't think I'm not really interested in that option. I just want to have a good time. With a handsome man like you, one meeting. And then it's every man for himself." Max hesitated, but after a few more persuasions, he agreed. But if he'd known how it would end. Ashley left the guy her address. They agreed to meet a couple of days after work. Max was looking forward to the meeting, already anticipating a great time. But fate had completely different plans for that evening. The guy did not prepare for the evening. He only chose a more or less decent outfit and styled his hair to look more attractive in the eyes of the girl. At some point in his head, he thought that he should take flowers, but he immediately canceled it. She was the one who had invited him. She had insisted on the meeting. Why should he splurge on her, and why should he try to please her? Standing by the door, Max reproached himself for coming empty-handed, but there was nowhere to go. He rang the bell, but there was no answer, reaching for the bell to ring again. He heard a strange rustling outside the door and opened it himself. Standing in front of him was a man who looked painfully similar to his father. He stared at Max absent-mindedly, never taking his eyes off him. Tears glistened in the corners of his eyes, but the boy was not to be broken by such things. He looked at the man carefully, asking with incomprehension, "I apologize, but this is Ashley's address. She left it for me a few days ago, and we'd arranged to meet. Maybe I just got the wrong house." He spoke calmly, though a storm was brewing in his soul. Could there really be people so similar? Or had his father been so close to him all this time? The man stood silent, as if he didn't know what to say either. The silence was becoming tense, so he abruptly walked over to the boy and enclosed him in his arms. "Son, I thought I would never see you again in my life," the man whispered. Max opened his eyes in surprise, not understanding how this could be. He struggled for a few seconds to figure out what was going on, and then sharply pushed the man away from him. Looking at him hatefully, he stated, "I have no father. That man left me as a child, and I have no idea how his life turned out. But I'm sure that if he lived just a few blocks away from me, he would certainly have found the courage to meet me sooner. Max turned around abruptly, intending to walk away, but at that moment he felt a firm hand on his wrist. Turning around abruptly, he looked at the man with hatred, not understanding what the man wanted from him. "Let go of my hand immediately, or I'll call the police," Max jerked, but he couldn't break free. He wanted to continue resisting as Ashley suddenly appeared behind the man's back. She looked at Max sympathetically, speaking out. "I'm sorry your life has turned out this way, but you really should listen to him. He'll tell you a lot of things you don't even realize." Max looked at the girl with incomprehension. For a few seconds he doubted the correctness of his next decision, but still he entered the house and agreed to listen to his father. But would he have known what he was about to learn? Max's father told him that for years he had been trying to get in touch. He had called, sent messages, and even letters, but they had all gone unanswered. He came home to his former spouse to try to reconcile, to return the relationship. But everything was unsuccessful. She did not believe in his words. And after a while, she filed a petition in court to limit Max's communication with his father. She cried all the time of the meeting, inventing horrible stories, which were not really. As a result, the judge issued a judgment on the basis of which the man could not go near his own son. He showed Max the court's judgment to somehow prove his words, showed numerous messages that were sent every year with a plea to allow him to communicate with the child. The man talked for a long time about how difficult it was for him all these years, how he missed and looked for all possible ways to see Max. He even spent 6 months behind bars for violating court requirements after numerous attempts to communicate with his son at school. It all seemed unrealistic, but the overwhelming evidence said otherwise. "I realize you don't have to believe me, but it's the truth," the man concluded, sighing heavily. Max thought about what had happened for a few minutes. After that, he asked with perplexity, "But what's your connection to her?" He pointed to Ashley, who had been standing next to him the whole time. "And that's your sister. I tried to find comfort in another woman, but the experience was just as sad," he sighed, closing his eyes. This was the unexpected way Max's life had turned. It would still take him a long time to understand and accept his father, but the feeling that he now had family in his world warmed his soul and gave him hope for a better future. When the man entered the room, the young nanny of his children bent down to pick up the toys. D4. Usually Mia made decisions quickly. Life just didn't give her any other options. But at the end of spring, she did have to reflect. For most of her life, Mia had worked for the owners. It used to be called a housekeeper. Today it's called a maid. In her long career, though, Mia had grown up to be a housekeeper. And now Mrs. Ann herself had suggested that her only daughter Chloe work for her in the summer, looking after the children. Mia knew if she mentioned it at home, her daughter would jump at the offer. Chloe loved babies, much more than her peers who had siblings. Chloe grew up as an only child. Many times she told her mother that she wished she had a sister. "It's more fun to be sick together, Mummy," she explained when she was little. "You always make me swallow candied honey when I have a cold. It's so sticky and it hurts my throat. And if I had a sister, would we make faces or grimaces when you gave us those nasty yellow lumps? We'd make fun of the faces we made, and we'd breathe on the smoking potatoes together under a blanket. And then we'd eat those potatoes with butter and tell each other scary stories late into the night, lying in bed." Chloe never reproached her mother. She just dreamed aloud how nice it would be if she had a sister. But Mia still felt guilty. She went to work early and came back late, and so tired that she no longer had the energy for a normal evening life like other people. Chloe felt sorry for her mother and learned early to do housework. When she came back from school, she would have been able to run around to her girlfriends instead of homework. But having finished with her lessons, she would take care of the household, prepare dinner for her mother's arrival, start the laundry. Dust didn't linger on the shelves, and it was so pleasant to walk barefoot on clean and damp floors. If there was one thing that made her acquaintances jealous when it came to Mia, it was her daughter. A beautiful girl, she studies well and does everything in the house for the mistress, while her peers paint their nails. Chloe bakes pies, but Mia realized that her daughter's vocation is not a vocation at all, but a conscience. Chloe loves her mother. There's only 2 of them left in the world. That's why when Chloe wants the same things as other girls, the same nails, the same music in the headphones, the same parties at friends, she remembers that her mother gives her best at work, so at least at home she should be freed from doing things. And Chloe knows how hard every dollar is given to her mother, and she doesn't ask for anything. On the contrary, happy to work, if there is an opportunity to bring the family an extra penny. And Mia denies her daughter that income. A sharp knife, because they are only two left in the world, and do not want that by 30 years Chloe faded. So that not to look at the stars, and on the toilet bowl, which must be cleaned to a mirror shine. So Mia was thinking about whether to offer her daughter a job for 3 summer months, or to tell Mrs. Ann at once not to count on Chloe. Mia herself once had no choice. She also grew up with her mother in the same wooden house on the outskirts of the city of Los Angeles, not even on the outskirts in the green zone, where at that time there was only a forest, 2 factory prophylactics and a hospital for tuberculosis patients. There the patients were isolated from society and were fed a fermented drink made from cow's milk and poured into bottles exactly like those given to children in milk kitchens. There were also about 15 cottages, more rustic than urban. They were inhabited by those who worked in the prophylactic centers and in the hospital. They had a hard time, because all they enjoyed was fresh forest air and work nearby. And they had to get to shops and everything else by bus, which ran once an hour. Less often it was possible, but not more often. But when those times were over, these places became a tidbit for the new rich. Wooden houses were bought up, the forest around them was cut down, and mansions began to grow here, one higher and more beautiful than the other. First her mother, and then Mia herself were offered to buy their house. And the buyers were very different. Some of them persistently persuaded the owners. Others kept such a tone that one had to fear refuse them, and at night your house will set fire to your house. After all, the buyers were not interested in a simple house with 3 windows, but in land, the land of the national park, a plot surrounded by a pine forest, a stone's throw from the river. And then my mother fell ill, got seriously ill, and never got up again. And she said to her daughter, "I want to die in my house down to the last plank, down to the last blade of grass. Men don't have that sentimentality, they only twist their fingers. Come on, Grandma, let's move to a city flat. There's a clinic a stone's throw away and a pharmacy on the ground floor. You've had enough." Mom loved everything here, the wooden porch and the boards. My grandfather built it, that porch. And peonies, daisies, apple trees all grandmother planted, and pink flowers, the names of which nobody knows, generously sprout every spring and stretch upwards. And at the end of July are already above the windowsill, and in the window to the sick peeking say, "How are you here?" I'm like an old tree. I can't be transplanted with roots, my mother said, not getting out of bed. I want to stay in my room until my last day and leave, looking at my flowers, at that spruce that grew with me, and is now so tall you could make a ship's mast out of it. Mia was finishing school then. What was there to do? I couldn't go away to study. You can't leave Mum alone. And you couldn't live on Mum's pension either. I'll get a job, she thought. And the garden fed its owners. But it wasn't enough for Mum's medicine and everything else. So when another mansion was built near their house, the new owners moved in and advertised that they were looking for a housekeeper. Mia was scared out of her wits and decided to give it a try. It was still a young family, a husband and wife. The wife's name was Mrs. Ann and the husband's name was Michael. Mrs. Ann had her own institute. Yes, her own private institute, which gave a very good education. It was a business given to Ann by her parents. The girl grew up spoiled, shone at school, won all competitions and Olympiads. Then she graduated from an economic university with honors and immediately began her PhD thesis. Rich parents who wanted to see their daughter at the head of the family business realized it is not her. Anne went headlong into science. And now she is the rector of the university in 30 and a little. She has under her command work excellent teachers. The building is one of the most beautiful in the city, and to study here are strictly treated. Here students will not be able to work part-time somewhere else and attend lectures at will. From time to time it will not be possible to pass an exam or credit by paying a teacher. Here you study seriously, and all the years spent in the walls of the university. Students see nothing but classrooms, library and atrium, where the institute's festivities take place. But during the years of study you can get a foreign internship. And after graduation, you were already expected to work in a prestigious firm. Employers were queuing up for Mrs. Ann's graduates. Well, the couple were very different. Mrs. Ann was a young woman, dressed austere. Her age was uncertain. Her short hair had begun to gray early. She wore thick black-rimmed glasses rather than lenses when she had vision problems. She bought expensive but austere clothes without any hint of femininity. Jackets, trousers, blouses in the style of men's shirts. It seemed all the more surprising that Mrs. Ann had chosen such a husband. Michael, though the same age as her, was of a different mold. Very good-looking, like some kind of artiste, but a chatterbox. When Mia came to the interview, their first meeting with the landlady was called an interview. The girl didn't realize that the handsome man who hung around the house, not knowing what to do with himself, was the landlady's husband. Mrs. Ann was perhaps even more scrupulous about keeping house than she was about her students. Mia knew only that her mistress had been used to servants since childhood, but it was difficult to find a common language with them. Later, Mia learned that she had become the 10th in the last year. Of those who had picked up a Hoover in this house, no one before her had ever stayed here for long. The house was a large, two-story building that could fit a village cultural center. But of the few staff, only a housekeeper and a gardener were hired. The interview was paid for. It meant that any girl would spend at least half a day traveling to the countryside. Mia's eyes widened in surprise when she was told about the money. Pay me for what? It's not like I did anything. She was different from the ones the agency sent at all. There were modern girls, and Mrs. Ann was a little tormented. She'd become quite a good physiognomist by talking to the students. Mrs. Ann had no doubt that the next applicant, who first of all asks about salary, schedule, and weekends, will not remember all her requirements, which meant they would soon have to part ways. So what's next? One has to spend time selecting another housekeeper. Mia had the looks of an 18-year-old girl and the eyes of a grown-up, tired woman. Try to maintain a carefree look when your mother is hopelessly ill, and all the cares of the family have fallen on your shoulders. Besides, not even hoping to be taken in, Mia still sat in front of the potential mistress with a notepad and wrote down wishes. The holy place was Mrs. Ann's office. God forbid she should be careless with office equipment cords, dust off her laptop with a common rag, or move papers so that the landlady couldn't find them right away. No using the host's belongings under any guise. No apologies, I'm sorry, I accidentally put on your slippers or wiped myself with your towel. Her work will be from 6 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon, and during this time you need to have time to do all the household chores, and iron the laundry, and prepare lunch, so that when the mistress returns, everything will be in order. Do you understand? Mrs. Ann asked, looking at Mia over her glasses. No one had ever called the girl you before. She was embarrassed, blushed, and said she would try harder. Mia decided that she would do her best to keep this place because it was her salvation. The mansion is right next to her house, always able to run to her mum if there was an emergency. At 3 o'clock, she, Mia, would be free by now and would rush to feed her mum lunch. And the salary, if the landlady's not lying, will allow her and her mum to forget about the lack of money. Are you all right with that? Of course. Well, come with me then. I'll tell you more about your duties. And Mrs. Ann walked briskly through the house, Mia following her with the same notebook in her hand. Mia knew from the tone of her voice that she had to remember everything the first time, that no one would repeat it, and that it was better not to make mistakes later. Mrs. Ann was conservative. She was used to a certain kind of soap and toothpaste, to the smell of expensive washing powder, to soft peach towels. How to make the bed, in what order to arrange boxes, jars, and vases in the kitchen cupboard so that everything could be found with closed eyes. Yes, there was a lot to memorize, but Mia was so attentive to every word of her mistress that she was practically never wrong from the first days of work. And just as importantly, she knew her place. They say there was one girl among the maids who was so shallow that she dared to address the mistress as you. And it was certainly her last day in this house. Mia not only did not allow herself to be pandered to, she did not dare to speak too much, only asking questions if there was sometimes a question about cleaning or if she did not know where to put something or what to cook. The rest of the time Mia labored around the house like a bee, dusting everywhere. Until she got used to it, it wasn't easy for her. But it was Michael, the landlady's husband, who made life difficult for her. No, not even the semblance of an affair between them. For Mia, it was taboo. She knew her place. Michael also did not notice the girl too gray and unremarkable she was in his view. Why would he need such a girl when his wife has a lot of beauties in the institute? But soon Mia was calling Michael nothing but a pig. Mrs. Ann had been at work for a long time when Michael first got up, had a leisurely and tasteful breakfast, walked around the house in his dressing gown, and eventually left too. He was listed with Mrs. Ann as someone at the institute, leaving behind a room that needed a daily general cleaning. Unlike the neat and punctual Mrs. Ann, Michael would not bend down to pick up a fallen item. It wouldn't occur to him to make his bed. But most of all, Mia was worried about her host's expensive laptop. Michael could easily pour coffee over it and fill it with crumbs. And if after that expensive equipment stopped working suddenly, Mia would be blamed. Every day she waited with bated breath for the landlady to say that she had done something wrong and she would be sacked. Mrs. Ann kept a close eye on the girl, reprimanding her sparingly. And by New Year's Eve, she gave Mia not only her salary but also a bonus in an envelope. The girl did not have time to buy herself a warm down jacket and boots, which she dreamed of and needed so much. Suddenly her mother passed away. Grief, like a bottomless well. The loan for the funeral, the need to pay it off, and the desire to leave after her mother, all this surrounded Mia with a black blizzard. Maybe because after so many years of living together with her mother, for the first time she was alone and felt fiercely lonely, this hasty marriage happened. Her future husband was a neighbor. Or rather, there was a family of neighbors, elderly spouses, formerly belonging to the middle class. After retirement, they had bought a cottage in the Green Belt, and they had an only son, Ben, who was much older than Mia. Ben had long ago left for another city, a regional center, and was building a personal life there. And then suddenly his parents started looking for a bride. Mrs. Caroline had talked to Mia in the shop, walked her home, and asked her to visit. She looked round, asked for tea, and spoke slowly and thoroughly about her son. With his first wife, he was unlucky. She was a mercantile woman. So Ben recently divorced, and the ex-wife took everything from him. The worst part was the flat. Mrs. Caroline's voice had changed to one of hatred. We helped to buy the place. Ben did a beautiful renovation. He took a year's leave from the institute and spent a whole year fixing up the house. Can you believe it? He did everything with his own hands. Wardrobes, shelves, hangers. And that wretch Emma. She thought she'd paid me off, said Mrs. Caroline. She borrowed money from someone, called Ben back, paid him back, tears. You can't buy anything decent with that money. And Emma said they were even, the way she'd packed. You wouldn't believe the bags she stuffed with cheap stuff. You know, the kind they sell in grocery shops, paper ones, full of stuff. I stuffed everything in there, and unwashed pans with grease dripping from them, and my downy shawl that I'd forgotten, stuffed the bags, put them in the hallway. Go away, Basya, and give me the keys. And this fool started playing the noble game. My father and I persuaded Ben you should have sued your Emma, and for every rag, because there are no children in common. Why feel sorry for such a cheat, but no, he just walked away. When he showed me how much money Emma had given him, my father and I gasped, just enough for a room in an old foundation. You know, the ones that are going to be demolished. They say there's a whole city resettlement program coming up. They'll move out the communal rooms and give him a one-bedroom, but in the meantime, as soon as he has a free moment, he comes to us, such a golden boy, and he's so unlucky. We'd find a girl, even if she was poor, but decent. And we'd live happily ever after, like me and my father. Mrs. Caroline was no longer acting as a matchmaker, but as the owner of a purse that needed to find a suitable mate and procreate. How can Jack and I be without grandchildren in our old age? How old are you? 19. It's about time you had a baby. It's about time, girl. Mia, who'd been trying not to contradict her elders since she'd started working as a maid, had lost her right to speak and listened. Mrs. Caroline drew her conclusions and brought her son to meet her the next weekend, as soon as he arrived. Ben was a short man of 34 with a disproportionately large head and sparse, downy hair. He was beginning to show a bald spot. He was dressed differently from his peers. Mia couldn't help thinking that his mom had probably picked out his clothes for him and carefully stored them away year after year. You don't see those blue and white flowered shirts with small white letters in any shop anymore. Maybe they used to sell them. Ben immediately looked at Mia with admiration, not knowing her at all. Just by looking at her, he already seemed to be in love. His eyes were blue and his gaze as simple-minded as a child's. And immediately, after that first meeting, Ben began to court the girl. He came every weekend, and during the week he called and talked to Mia. He brought her some trinkets, perfume, and a black velvet bag, a beautiful cup and saucer. Perhaps Mia had never been able to buy anything like that for herself. They lived on a pittance, and Ben proposed marriage very quickly a month after they met. By then he'd already fixed Mia's porch and was digging beds. And Mrs. Caroline was constantly giving the girl home-cooked food or something sweet for tea. It created the illusion of a family for Mia. It seemed that she was gradually being incorporated into it, like a jigsaw puzzle, taking her place in the overall picture. Of course, Mrs. Caroline won't replace Mum. They can't even be next to each other, Mia thought. But I'll have a husband to take care of me, and my mother-in-law will be my soulmate. The loneliness would end. And Mia said yes. A month later they were married. And a year began for Mia, which she later recalled as something strange and unreal. Ben willingly left his communal flat and moved in with her. It took Mia, inexperienced in these matters, 3 weeks to realize that Ben was an inveterate alcoholic. Before, his parents had poured him a glass of cold water when they sent him to visit a girl. And during his brief, no longer bachelor period, Ben kept to himself, didn't drink. But when he felt himself an independent head of the family, he went into all sorts of trouble. If he and his young wife were out for a walk, Ben would go to the shop for a minute and then go on with a bottle. In the evenings, he would take a bottle and ask to go somewhere under the plausible pretext, I have to help a friend, or I've been called to work. In reality, Ben would go to a nearby bar and stay there for hours before coming home drunk. Mia cried and demanded a promise from her husband that it was the last time, that it was the very, very last drink. And Mrs. Caroline had a heart-to-heart talk. Nothing worked. Under the threat of divorce, Ben went to a desperate step for himself, found somewhere in the private sector, a hypnotist grandmother who encodes to classical music with a guarantee, as he told himself. In fact, Ben may have been to the woman, but he would go straight from her to the shop. He would have a drink on the way and return home, swaying, with a branded dark bag and with his naive blue eyes showing that the bag was empty and therefore there was nothing to scold him for. Mia's character had changed so much over the year that, having been quiet before, in November she smashed a bottle of vodka against the kitchen sink and, holding the shards in her hands, demanded that Ben leave immediately, along with his belongings. And in December, Mia gave birth to a daughter and named her Chloe. The parents stood up for their son. They sold their house and flat and bought a new flat in the regional center, where they settled together. The father, thanks to his connections, got certificates about Ben's low income in the new place. It's nothing, which means the child support will be symbolic. You feel sorry for your child and we feel sorry for ours, Mrs. Caroline told Mia over the phone in an icy voice. All friendship with her mother-in-law ended instantly. There was no mention of gifts for her granddaughter, and Mia had only one hope left for Mrs. Ann, who, against all odds, had saved a place for her while the young woman was unable to go to work after giving birth. Chloe was 3 months old when Mia entrusted her to a neighbor and went to work. Even a still young, full-figured woman managing such a large house would be hard, especially when you consider the demands Mrs. Ann had made on the household. Sometimes, if Mia had the energy to read a book or watch a film in the evenings, she drew parallels. So, watching the film in bed with the enemy, the main villain demanded of his wife that the towels in the bathroom should be mixed to the same length, 3 pieces hanging evenly, edge to edge. Mia thought that Mrs. Ann had not yet reached such a point, but probably will soon. And later, while reading the novel The Defeated, Mia burst into flames and said to her daughter, who was then about 8 years old, "Look, Chloe, how well written. I've never seen such an insufferable old woman before. She's a neat little bore. She's only uses 8 towels, and they're all hung on nails. God forbid they get mixed up. She squeaks, and she's got eyes like a lynx. They'll spot her. You can't just wipe the table, but first with rag number 1, and then with rag number 2. And there are 8 rags, too." "Is your landlady as mean as that?" Chloe asked. "No, but Mrs. Ann has 1,000 rules she can't break. If I'd forgotten or messed up a few times, I'd have been kicked out the door too. What helped Mia was that she was responsible, conscientious, and at first she was so afraid of losing her place that there was nothing more important to her in life than doing things the way Mrs. Ann used to. But afterwards it became a habit for Mia herself, and she began to fulfill her household rules on automatic. Sometimes when Mia returned from work, too broken, too exhausted, she would sneak pain pills. Chloe would ask her, "Get away from your Baba Yaga." But once Mia caught her breath, she asked, "Where would I go? I'm close to the house and I can come running any minute if you need me." And Mrs. Ann's pay is good and reliable. She's like a Swiss bank, even if she's demanding, even if she's not sentimental, but she pays fairly. And looking for another job, what am I going to find now? I've never learned anything in my life. All I know is how to do housework. At her landlady's house, Mia remained as silent as ever, never opening her mouth. But when Mrs. Ann decided to have children in her old age, the housekeeper sighed and said in a low voice, "It's going to be hard on you. You're judging yourself, aren't you?" Mrs. Ann might not have meant to be a bit of a sarcasm, it just came out of the blue. "No," said Mia, using a special brush to brush the dust off some super valuable Danish porcelain. "I understand the difference. Who was I when I gave birth to Chloe? Penniless, divorced. In my maternity ward, they wouldn't let loved ones into the room. They'd stand outside the windows. The girls called me at first, saying, 'Look, there he is, waving balloons, if it's yours.' I had to say that there was no one to visit me, even though I was married at that time, according to my passport. Then, a couple of months later, we got an official divorce. And for all these years, neither Ben, nor father-in-law, nor mother-in-law, who seemed to dream of a granddaughter and asked me to give birth. No one has never once asked about Chloe and did not come to visit, and gifts for the girl's birthday did not pass only a receipt for alimony. Once a month, the postman threw in the box generously alimony as much as 2,000, so that the daughter, as they say, do not deny themselves anything. I know, Mrs. Ann, that you wouldn't dream of living like this. May your little ones do well, but not like mine. I was always afraid I'd never get Chloe back on her feet. I wouldn't have the time. Something would happen to me and she'd be without her mom, and I wouldn't get to watch her grow up. I won't stand up for her if someone hurts her. I won't wipe away her tears if she cries." Mia was embarrassed and didn't continue. But she couldn't say that Mrs. Ann, for all her wealth, was not immune to disease or the accidents of fate. Medicine allowed her to give birth to twins at that age, and if everything was done artificially, twins are not uncommon. And then it was just a matter of asking God to let her raise her sons and enjoy them. And Mrs. Ann, though she was usually quick to use harsh, barbed words, this time she remained silent in thought. At that time, the nannies in the house were changing at the speed of light. Mrs. Ann would not have cared for Sam and Ben herself, not even in her mind. She wasn't going to leave school. As soon as the mistress got stronger after childbirth, no more dizziness and weakness in her legs, she hurried to her favorite university, to her office. Reading lectures and signing papers is much easier than babysitting twins, Mia thought. Mrs. Ann was incapable of such self-denial as enduring sleepless nights and putting up with the children's whims. Perhaps her mistress was afraid that she was missing time that she could never get back and would be alone in her old age. Because her useless husband Michael was no better than loneliness. That's why Mrs. Ann decided to have children, but she was not able to sacrifice her time and comfort for them. Nannies started coming to the house. She remembered the dog waltz with its simple rhythm. Everything was played out like a sheet music. Another applicant at the interview, the girl was delighted with the salary and conditions, and 2 or 3 days of work and a kick under the heel point, because none of them could not please. Mia had her own relationship with the nannies, whom her landlady Mrs. Ann changed like gloves. Some the housekeeper supported, though there wasn't much she could do. Mia would take another sacked nanny into the kitchen and give her tea. "Don't cry," she'd say. "I can tell you one thing for sure, Mrs. Ann won't write you a bad reference. She just won't take the trouble. She'll forget you exist tomorrow. So you'll be fine. You'll get a new job, you'll make money." She talked to me like that. The resentment and bitterness of exile choked her. Now, I have the feeling that there is no one worse than me in the world, that I am the laziest and most promiscuous. But to put it all out of my head, It seems to me that the mistress has such a character that she herself is not always happy about it. It's the same with children. You know what they say about kids he sat on gray? This is when a child realizes that he is behaving badly, that he is just being cranky for nothing. Then he's disgusted with himself, but he can't help it. That's how it is with Mrs. Ann. She has no one left in her life except her husband. Her parents are already dead, her children are still small, and all the energy she has after work, after the institute, all her thoughts she stuffs with such nonsense that the vases on her shelf should stand in a certain order, and the servants should walk in one half, and so on. Wave your hand and get out of here. You're about to have a new life. When the girl's grief had subsided a little, she found the ability to think about someone other than herself. How have you survived so many years here? The former nanny clapped her wet eyelashes, but Mia wasn't being sincere. Well, someone has to keep an eye on this house, she said. And you go home now and forget about what happened. But not every fired employee deserves sympathy. Mia knew there were those who hoped to sneakily ignore the housekeeper's rule. It's a case of just in case. The housekeeper was not going to comfort anyone, but only thought that she would have a hard time in the near future. While the mistress was looking for a new nanny, Mia had to take care of the babies. Michael was not only not a good father, but no father at all. He let the children do anything, as long as they did not cry or bother him, did not interfere with his life. Mrs. Ann nearly fainted once. She came home and saw Sam and Peter running across the open piano with bare feet right on the keys. And the piano, by the way, is a 19th century piano from a famous German company. The children were left to Michael, and he quietly settled in a soft armchair with headphones on, watched some action film. From that very day, the father's role in the family became purely decorative. Mrs. Ann no longer assigned him to look after the children. On the contrary, the newly hired nanny was told to see that the twins did not sneak into their father's room and do something with his connivance. As a result, the father could say hello to his sons, meeting them by chance in the big house, stroke the boys on the head, ask how they were doing, but no more. This situation suited both parties, children and adults alike. In the period of supervision, Mia watched over the boys and fed and entertained them without fail. Sometimes Chloe also came to help. The twins adored her. They perceived the girl as an older sister. No one could think of such exciting games. And at the same time, Chloe watched closely to ensure that the kids did not make trouble, do not go wild in the house, and nothing happened to them. Once Mrs. Ann returned unexpectedly from a business trip. Chloe was playing with the children in the garden. The three of them spread a blanket on the grass and competed to see who could come up with the scariest story. No one heard the wicket door open. Mrs. Ann stood looking at the friendly group and said to Mia, "I wouldn't mind if your daughter became a childminder during the summer holidays." This was a complete surprise to Mia. So the landlady was willing to pay her daughter's salary. But the housekeeper didn't even nod. Listened to the offer nonchalantly. She was going to give it to her daughter and let her decide for herself. Chloe saw herself, and from the stories of her mother knew that the work in this house is not sugar. So it was up to her to agree or not. "Oh, let's give it a try," Chloe lit up. "I was looking for something while I was free from school anyway. Do you think it would be easier for me to waitress in a cafe or dishwasher or camp counselor? Let's at least spend the summer together. I don't see you with your job." Well, look what happened to the next babysitter. Until now, Chloe was amused to hear stories about the hapless maid. Mia just shrugged her shoulders. It's easy to guess they fired her again. Why? This time she deserved it. Mia said it in her heart. An old woman came in and needed the money so badly she made the big mistake of pleasing the kids. You know how that turned out? The boys ended up smashing an antique statue that Mrs. Ann had brought back from somewhere in Europe. But most importantly, they sneaked into the landlady's study, got into a fight, and knocked coffee over her laptop. It's an oil painting, isn't it? I don't need to explain to you what happened next. Chloe sighed. I can imagine. So you're going to have to, if you take it on. And until the new nanny comes in, haul all that load from morning till night. Wake the boys up, dress them, feed them, and work on them till bedtime. Mrs. Ann's going to Chicago for a week. But you know how she is. Everything in the house must go on without her. No indulgences. Chloe didn't think long. Tell her tomorrow morning that I agree. And she did not say how much she would pay me. For the first time after Chloe took up her duties, everything went quietly. Mrs. Ann didn't seem to look at the girl much, but both Nanny and her mother knew that she didn't. The mistress notices everything. And if Chloe gets offense, she'll be refused a place. And yet the girl was a little easier than other nannies. Firstly, she sincerely attached to the children, and the feeling was mutual. Secondly, on every question Chloe could turn to her mother for advice. Soon Mrs. Ann did leave as she had intended. It was then that everything began. Michael, in the eyes of Mia, called Mia by patronymic, but in the eyes of the patronymic he did not deserve. So Michael usually, when his wife was not at home, spent his time quite pleasantly. He either relaxed in the garden, where there were pools, sunbeds to sunbathe, and a gazebo, where it is so nice to sit in the summer with a glass of something cool. If the weather didn't cooperate, they could sit in the living room by the fireplace or in the marital bedroom on the huge Arabian-style bed. Mia thought the bed had been bought for Michael's sake, too. Mrs. Ann had gone along with his craving for luxury. But when Chloe came into the house, Michael changed his habits. Now he sort of remembered that he was a father, and he looked in on the boys more often than ever. And they, unaccustomed to such attention, did not know how to behave. You can't be naughty. Sam and Peter had learnt that. What else could they do with this man smiling at them and asking how they were doing? Who would know him? Mia guessed that Michael had his own plans and tried to stay close to her daughter. That afternoon it started to rain lightly. Chloe and the twins were in the nursery. Mia was putting away things hidden from prying eyes by the open wardrobe doors she did not see, but felt that there was someone else in the room. And then through the cracks she saw someone she couldn't even think of as the owner. "Isn't it time for them to go to bed?" Michael asked. His voice sounded a little hoarse to Mia. "We're past our bedtime," Chloe said, taking a box of knots off the shelf. "We sleep until 4. "It's a pity." "Well, what then, girl?" "Now we have a scheduled walk, but you see what's outside the window." The girl bent down to pick up the fallen toys. Mia didn't immediately realize what had happened. Chloe was in denim shorts. From the sudden movement, the edges of her panties showed from under them. A strange sound came from where the door was. Michael choked. He literally choked on his saliva, drooling. What an accurate thing someone had once said. Mia folded the sheet in 4 and came out of the wardrobe. Now the owner had to pick his jaw up off the floor instead of drooling. "Are you home too?" was all he could find to say. "I'm always home." Mia's voice was impassive, though her insides were raging. "Michael, did you want to play with the kids?" "Me? No, please don't mind. I won't bother you." As soon as the man left, Mia slammed the door behind him. "Did you see that?" she asked. She thought Chloe should have realized it. Her daughter surprised her by raising her eyebrows in bewilderment. "What was I supposed to see? How he looked at you. But so were you." "I bet he did, wearing a thong to work." That old bastard. Mia never swore in front of her daughter. But today she didn't hold back, with all the profanity of a sailor. "He's not old at all." Chloe sat down on the carpet, opening a box with knots, and the twins immediately surrounded her. Mia was silent, and then came and stood so that her daughter looked at her willy-nilly. Chloe lowered her eyes. "You know that you and I are alone in the house now," Mia said. "The servants," Chloe said, emphasizing her mother's position. "The servants," Mia continued stiffly. "And so I'll tell you, I've never wondered how two people as different as Mrs. Ann and her husband came to be together. In my opinion, he's not a good match for her." "Well, that's as simple as it gets. She bought it. What's there to guess at? He's 10 times her age and probably suits her in every way. He's doing just fine living here on his own." Chloe, maybe, was waiting for her mother to object. But Mia continued in the same tone. Her daughter hadn't heard her say that before. "Anyway, it's their life. And you and I have been given the trust of letting us into this house that has opened up before us. And it has never, ever occurred to me to take anything here, not a biscuit in the kitchen, let alone another man's husband." "I see," said Chloe. "What do you understand?" I see now why Mrs. Ann loves you so much. She needn't get a dog with you. And what? A golden woman serves. She keeps quiet, barks at strangers, protects her master's goods. Chloe suddenly changed. Mia asked almost pitifully. It is you, so Ben once could say so, but from you. Chloe was silent, then said, machine folding puzzles, well, what now to regret? All the time should have chosen a father of pure, noble blood. Mia felt infinitely tired. Well, the only thing I'll ask of you is that I'll think of a reason why you can't work here anymore. Today you have already worked as much time as you should, and tomorrow. Chloe was silent. She was making a beautiful tower out of cardboard squares, and her fingers trembled slightly. All right, she said at last. And I also thought you were right. Remember when you said you wanted to go to New York or Los Angeles? And now I can see for myself that you shouldn't stay here after high school. The further you go, the more you change, the more you become a new bird. You used to be different, and now you're going to look at me funny. I'll still be a maid. Our house will remain old and dilapidated. In short, whatever I can put away until you pass your exams. I'll give you all this money, and God be with you. You know how to do everything, you've learned everything, and I think you'll do well. But we can talk until then. Chloe looked into her mother's eyes for the first time, and something in the girl's gaze flashed so childish, former. And both mother and daughter laughed embarrassed. The storm had passed. The last school year passed quietly for Chloe. She never found out what Mia said to her mistress. But the girl was no longer invited to work as a nanny. You better try harder at school, said her mother. Do you still have to go to university? Mia thought that Mrs. Ann, if she was so good to Chloe, might offer her a place at her university. But the thought flashed and quickly disappeared. Mia knew how much it cost to study at a private institute. And Mrs. Ann was very good with money. She had no reason to give her housekeeper's daughter such a luxurious gift. Nothing much seemed to have changed in the life of the little family. As before, the tired mother returned in the evenings from work, and Chloe had time to study for honors and run the household. Enough with Mia, God. And yet for the first time between mother and daughter there was some reticence. Chloe passed her final exams with high marks. Helped the girl also that she was not nervous. God knows why. When they were taken to another school to pass literature, Chloe's friend became ill. Worries, stress. The teacher, who came with the guys, did not allow to approach Inna. The organizers themselves called an ambulance to the girl. When the medics left, Chloe sat looking at the pale faces of the graduates, gnawed the cap of a cheap plastic pen, and wondered why she herself did not tremble inside. Probably because Chloe realized that no matter how she passed her exams, the life she had set for herself would not leave her. So what was there to worry about? Chloe received high scores. If she stayed in her city, the choice of educational institutions for her would be small. But her mother looked as if in water in her thoughts the girl swung to the capital universities. Mia saved money as well as a handsome young man. But she still gave her daughter a decent sum to Chloe to buy a dress not worse than other girls. In her daughter's classmates it was a real quest, which they passed with burning eyes. To order in the atelier or to buy. And if to buy, where to buy? Short or ball gown style. Or maybe a chic evening dress, sparkling with rhinestones. Mia paid not only for the dress but also for everything she was supposed to: photos, videotaping, a restaurant. Certificates to the best graduates were handed out in the town square. The guys who received medals stood on an improvised stage, and a golden rain of confetti fell on their heads. Glitter was left to shine in the girls' ceremonial hairstyles. And Mia cried for the first time in years. Maybe for the first time since her mother's death. The main stage of her dream, getting her daughter back on her feet, was behind her. Yes, there was still university ahead, a diploma. But still, if something happened to her, Chloe would not be lost. Somewhere, but will enter. And the main thing, she will not be given to an orphanage. Thoughts of orphanage often came to Mia, because she knew her daughter has no one but her. In all these years, Ben had never appeared on the horizon. Never once brought his daughter a birthday present, never asked if Chloe needed anything. Immediately after the divorce was formalized, Ben's parents hustled and found him a new wife, older, and with a teenage son. The wife was patient and obediently endured her husband's drunkenness. For this, her father-in-law and mother-in-law constantly gave her gifts and promised her a flat after his death. Mia knew if she left before the deadline on the other world, and Chloe in the family of his father will not be taken, and surrendered to the state. Now the daughter is an adult. Mia wiped the tears running down her cheeks, and Chloe seemed to her more beautiful than Botticelli's Venus. That evening at the restaurant, Mia sat in the corner of a long table, in the farthest and darkest corner, not mingling with the other parents, and drank too much. She hadn't had a more worthy occasion in years past to relax, to take a short break from the harness she was pulling. When Chloe, in her silk dress, approached her mother, Mia looked at her daughter with an unseeing and slightly hazy look and could say nothing. "I see." The phone was in the girl's hand. Having just taken selfies, she started dialing a number. "I'll send you home in a taxi now," Chloe said. Mia tried to object that it was expensive, that other parents would give her a lift, since the buses were no longer running. But Chloe wouldn't listen. Once home, Mia was going to wait for her daughter, to make sure she had met the dawn and arrived safely. But instead, as she was in her best dress suit, she fell asleep on the bed. And in the morning, having made sure that Chloe was in her room, Mia went to work as usual and dusted with a special brush, and scolded herself for the fact that after yesterday's shaking hands. Chloe passed the competition in the institute she chose and went to Los Angeles. Mia was anxious to go with her. She would take her daughter to a strange and unfamiliar city, help Chloe to settle in the hostel, and look at the famous city, which she had never seen before. It would have been the biggest trip of Mia's life. But Chloe wouldn't take her. "I'll do it myself," she said. "You'll be tired going back and forth, the road and all that. I'm a pretty independent person. Have you forgotten?" Mia knew one thing: her daughter had grown more and more confident over the years. Now her tone was such that it was not Chloe to her mother, but her mother to her. Chloe left. Mia was left alone. She still worked for Mrs. Ann, and she was so used to her housekeeper that she never took on any other servants but her. If there was a general cleaning of the housekeeper invited the women from the cleaning company. Mrs. Ann was a rather demanding mistress, and even just listening to her was enough to make Mia whisper in her ear, "Have you been working for her so long? My God, how have you stayed here so long?" Mia just shrugged her shoulders. She didn't understand why she lived in this place, and never tried to change it. And now she wanted to take on a heavier job so that she wouldn't think about anything, so that she'd be tired to death. And not to disturb her memory, not to make her soul whimper. Idleness was her enemy even now. She saw her late mother, and then she realized that Chloe would never return to her hometown. And Mia could not drive away from herself the question whether she had not flushed her own life into that waste place, which she had to clean every day. Did she have no choice, or did she? And she'd missed it. When the owners were away in Los Angeles, which was often, when Mrs. Ann had some scientific business there, Mia had the nerve to ask Chloe to bring her some things from home. The hostess pressed her lips together a little, but did not refuse. Of course, she did not take the trouble to visit the girl. She came to the hotel herself. It didn't occur to Mia that it was humiliating for Chloe to appear as an uninvited guest and in an expensive hotel to take those hopeless checkered bags at the reception. That's what the shuttles used to carry. The bags were like a stamp, like a stigma. The front desk girls would hide their grins when she picked them up. And one time Chloe couldn't take it anymore and called home. "I got everything, but don't need any more, don't pass it on. I've got everything." Mia realized that her daughter had taken another step sideways, severed another thread linking her to home apple jam and her mother's bound socks. Socks didn't fit into Chloe's new life, and yet the daughter called more or less regularly, did not forget to congratulate her mother on holidays. "Happy birthday," Chloe would say. Mia herself would not even remember about it. If Chloe could not get out to visit, it is understandable. She had a session, or practice, or some friends called, and it is impossible to refuse. Mia was not offended, she was quietly sad. Chloe didn't live in the hostel anymore. She worked part-time, rented a flat with a friend for two. Mia thought that her daughter would probably get married soon. Once again, when the owners left for Los Angeles, Mrs. Ann returned early. "I'm alone," she said nonchalantly, "no matter what happened. But this time Mia sensed trouble, and she wasn't wrong. "We need to talk." "Let's go into the study," Mrs. Ann said. Mia followed and thought about what she was about to hear. She was being fired. This way everything could be solved on the spot. No need to have a conversation in the office. Mrs. Ann sat down at the antique desk, which she loved very much. "Sit down," she said, pointing to the chair opposite. She was silent for a minute or two, then spoke this time. "I didn't just go to a scientific conference. I saw a doctor. He confirmed the diagnosis." Mrs. Ann named the disease. Mia gave a startled gasp. She'd heard it was a short-lived disease, a year and a half. Only 7% passed the 5-year mark. And only a few people live long. Mrs. Ann translated the diagnosis into numbers. "Are you going to cry?" "No time. There's a lot to do, a lot to do." She began to list what she'd come up with in the last sleepless nights. Sam and Peter would be going away to an expensive public school. There was no telling how things would turn out. They'd better get used to it right away. There they would be brought up to adulthood. Their eyes met. And they both remembered the conversation they'd had long ago, when Mia had mentioned her main fear, not being able to raise her daughter in time. But Mrs. Ann had other options. Her children would not be lost. "I'm going away for treatment." "No, not abroad. To the same doctor where I was, the same hospital. But I won't be home for long. You'll see to it that everything goes on as usual." Mrs. Ann paused again and added, "And if anything, you'll see to the funeral." With a gesture, she stopped Mia's objection. "I'll give all the arrangements to the funeral parlor. Just pay, and they'll do it for you. It'll just take an outside eye to see if everything's going right. As you realize, I can't do it myself. And Michael's always missing the important or the unimportant." And Mrs. Ann did go away for a long time, 6 months. She'd call Mia from time to time, asking about the house, giving her directions. Although Mia had been a housekeeper for so many years that she knew the daily seasonal chores by heart, when to wash the windows, when to do the general cleaning, when to have the carpets cleaned. Mia didn't ask unnecessary questions. She tried to understand how her hostess was doing by her tone. The tone was uneven, lifeless. And then Mrs. Ann rang to say that she and her husband were coming back in 2 days. "Welcome back," she said. Mia couldn't believe that she missed her, that she was waiting for her mistress to arrive. With hidden joy and at the same time with fear, what news would she bring? She didn't have to ask. Mia realized everything herself when the mistress, leaning on her husband's arm, walked towards the house. It was not for nothing that Mrs. Ann had told her to prepare a room on the ground floor. Not the marital bedroom, not her favorite study. She couldn't climb the stairs. "No hospice," Mrs. Ann said. "I don't expect the walls of home to heal, but at least they're comforting." Mia was busy helping the patient to get settled. She hadn't expected Michael to look so upset, partly even confused. Was Mrs. Ann's husband more mentally organized than Mia had thought? She thought nothing could upset him. The housekeeper had become a carer. Mrs. Ann had a rare patience with pain. Mia realized, however, that medication couldn't take it away completely. But when it came to routine matters, the landlady was the same. Here she was at her best. It was as if Mia was back in the days of her youth, when she had been terrified of making a mistake, not making the coffee strong enough or too sweet, not changing the linen in time, not answering a question in the wrong words. It's a good thing Mrs. Ann was farsighted enough, and the twins, Sam and Peter, had gone to a boarding school beforehand. There was no need for the boys to see all this. Mia remembered the last few weeks as a blur. It was unreal. After Mrs. Ann said, "I want to tell you about Michael." Mrs. Ann was lying on her back. Mia made her comfortable on 2 soft pillows. It seemed to make the pain feel less. Or maybe it just seemed that way, and the metal in her mistress's voice was almost entirely gone. She could only speak quietly now, and quietly what metal? "I never thought I would draw a parallel with you. My fate and yours," Mrs. Ann said with a quiet, slightly perceptible chuckle. "But wait you. I was the only daughter in my family too. My parents were high-flying birds. Business owners of factories, newspapers, steamships. We're almost the same generation. You must remember this poem. They could have bought me anything. If the moon in the sky was for sale and I wanted it, they'd buy it, but they had a strict idea of who I could and couldn't be friends with. It was best not to be friends with anyone at all. My parents were used to not trusting anyone. Big business is a cruel business. Someone you thought of as a friend will become a competitor tomorrow. Well, I was a good girl. I stayed at home and read books. Fortunately, I always liked to read and always wanted to learn more. I was driven to and from school, and Michael was in the same class as me. Mia wanted to say, oh, she could barely contain herself. Mrs. Ann's husband looked at least 10 or 15 years younger than her. And now that Mrs. Ann was coping with her illness, Michael seemed like her son. He was the handsomest, brightest boy around me, Mrs. Ann continued. And I was very ordinary in appearance, a very ordinary girl. And I had no friends, but I had a lot of complexes because of book characters. It's like that they think their peers speak a different language. I couldn't fit in with any of my peers. I wasn't bullied, I was shunned. You know how a river goes round a rock on both sides and runs away? I didn't even try to get Michael to like me, because everyone would say I bought his attention. Even now, before, when people looked at us, they would say in hushed tones that I had bought myself a husband. You've probably heard those words more than once. Mia wouldn't admit to hearing them from her own daughter, Chloe. So I didn't fill my head with dreams and love, but tried to study, as one comrade used to say. And then came graduation night. Mrs. Ann stopped talking, taking a breath. I had a gold medal, like your Chloe. Well, the tradition of graduation is a timeless one. We sat in the restaurant, and then the whole group went out to see the sunrise. It took a long walk along a path through the woods to get to the riverbank. We wanted to wait until morning to watch the sun come up. For me, it was almost the first time I was allowed to go out with my class without guards or chaperones. Maybe I deserved it with my medal, and I was allowed such a holiday, allowed to go with the guys. After all, we were parting forever. We'll never see each other again. But for me, that trip almost ended in tragedy. Mrs. Ann closed her eyes and put her hand on Mia's arm, squeezing her cold fingers lightly. Imagine a large reservoir just above the dam. They're not called seas for nothing. These reservoirs, they're endless. When the hydroelectric power station was built, the river overflowed. Everyone knew that there were villages, old houses, even a church at the bottom. And the new banks turned out to be so steep, like precipices, sandy precipices. I don't remember why I got separated from the guys. Maybe I was distracted by something, but I was a few meters below the almost steep edge of the bank, and I couldn't grab onto anything. The slope was sandy, the sand was crumbling from under my fingers, and there was water and deep water below. I had read that near the hydroelectric power station the depth was 50 meters, but even here it was pretty deep, and I couldn't swim. No matter how many times my parents took me to seas and resorts, I never learned to swim. Don't shout, no one will hear you. Even if someone comes to help, they can't get me out. I could drown dozens of times. But I didn't even have time to call for help. I was just trying to stay where I was on the slope and not go into the water. And then I saw Michael. He'd fallen behind the others too. He knew right away that I was in trouble. He said, "Hold on. Don't move." I thought he was going to call the boys or our class teacher, Mrs. Olivia, who was coming with us. But instead, Michael ran into the woods and fetched a thick stick, lowered it to me, and told me to grab onto it as hard as I could. God, how ashamed I was. Mrs. Ann recalled, I've always been overweight, and he was carrying me. I could see how hard it was for him, but I couldn't let go either. I'd have died, He pulled me out in the end. I was in tears and snot from fear. My hair was all messed up. Remember what we used to say when we were kids, hairdo? I fell down, I almost crushed myself. My dress is dirty. I told Michael I was done with the sunrise meeting. So I went home. He ran round to ours, said sorry, we're leaving, and walked me all the way home. Nobody ever found out about that story. I've only just told you now, Mrs. Ann said to Mia. You might think that's when we started having an affair, don't you? Wait, Michael was just helping me out then without a second thought. And we went our separate ways. I went to college, he joined the army, then got married unsuccessfully. Anyway, we crossed paths by chance years later, and not even at a reunion, but just in the city, and we recognized each other immediately. I was always like that, short haircut, black-rimmed glasses. I would have recognized him, whatever he was. Maybe another girl would have forgotten about it long ago, But I remembered, and I'd never forget. I remembered that he saved my life. I mean, all the years I'd had since that cliff, all my luck, all my joy, the fact that I could breathe, feel, look at the sky, all of it was thanks to him. He gave it to me. Now, Mia, he was in trouble when we met. Mrs. Ann's cold fingers squeezed Mia's hand again. He's divorced now, and no one can know that. Never to anyone, ever. He was on drugs, a good one. And that's when I took it upon myself to save him. My dad was gone by then. Dad would never have let me get involved with a man like that in the first place. And Mom? I was already living on my own, and I could keep it from my mom for a long time. Michael didn't even have a place to live at the time. Just a room. The neighbors wanted to evict him because he had friends coming round. The door wouldn't close, and those friends would stay overnight, because in that state, when they'd already taken a dose, where would they go? I took Michael away, paid for his treatment in a very good clinic. He was treated abroad, lived there for a few months, came back and stayed with me. When he proposed to me, he probably didn't even think I would accept. The guys who knew me from childhood always felt the difference between me and them. And I said yes. As they say nowadays, I said yes gladly. I convinced myself I was married because he saved my life. I didn't admit to myself that I'd been in love with him since high school. And when Michael was out of my life, I felt very unhappy. That's not a very clear comparison, is it? Well, like a person who has nothing at all, because all I wanted was him. Him alone and no one else. You're about to tell me how everyone around you said Michael was just getting comfortable. He had money now. I got him a job at my institute. He was living comfortably from now on. But, I didn't care about that. It was worse than that. I always realized very well that he didn't love me. It's like a match, isn't it? It's like a match. It either flares up or it doesn't. Well, he never lit even a little flame of love for me. The kind of love that I would have lit in him. And my passion got kind of angry. I started demanding that other people do things my way. Because I couldn't do that with Michael. Long pause. Why am I telling you all this? Mrs. Ann continued. I thought Michael couldn't love anyone at all, only a life of luxury. Turns out he doesn't. He does. He loved your Chloe. Mia stopped breathing. And Mrs. Ann grinned. I knew it right away when I was in the hospital, when it was already known for sure that I would not recover. They met, and I didn't interfere. I even thought afterwards that maybe it would be better for him not to be alone. But in the end, your daughter rejected him. She just said she had another boyfriend, almost her age. She told him to go away and look after me, or he'd look like a real scoundrel in her eyes. His wife's dying, and he's lying there. Chloe had never let that stop her before. I'm gone. His mates left him. He's got nothing ahead of him. You know what Michael did? He did what all weak people do. He got back on drugs. That's why I'm telling you this old story, Mia. Not so you can fight with your daughter about me. But you had an alcoholic husband yourself. You know what fixes the hump, so I want you to keep an eye on him. By the time Mrs. Ann was finished, she had a persistent, painful dry cough, and no special syrup or water helped. Nothing worked. Finally, she was able to continue. He's in good health for now. I don't want him to end up like a drug addict. How? He won't listen to me, Mia said with tears in her voice. What am I to him? A servant. He'll listen to you. I've divided everything I have in my will. Most of it goes to the children. Michael will get a lot too, provided he gets treatment and he doesn't do anything like that for 3 years. Until then, he'll only get a monthly allowance and you'll get another share from me. Why me? I don't want anything. You don't have to look for another job, but you have to be there for him. That's a condition. Michael knows. Don't worry, I'm not going to control you. It wouldn't even occur to me. You have a head on your shoulders. You know our whole life and I have no one else to rely on. This will be your last job in Ann's family home. Understood? Now hand me my pills and go. I want to be alone. Mrs. Ann had to repeat her order one more time. There was no way Mia wanted to leave. She was afraid that the landlady, now that she had told her everything, might take her little white pills to kill herself. But everything went her way, and a month and a half later Mrs. Ann met the children calmly and quietly and said goodbye to them. Together with her agent, she planned her funeral down to the smallest detail. Mia was present for it. It must be the way royalty thinks things through. She'd said, "I wish Michael had been there for the last hour, but it wasn't an hour. It was just the last night." One morning, Mrs. Ann did not wake up. In the days that followed, although the city's largest funeral parlor did take care of the arrangements, by evening Mia was so exhausted that she found it difficult to speak. Her tongue was slurring. Perhaps Chloe had been right to call her mother Mistress's dog. Mistress was gone, and Mia was doing the routine and making sure that the ceremony went as Mrs. Ann wished. Chloe must have learnt what had happened from Michael. She called her mother and carefully, as if stepping through a minefield, expressed her condolences. Mia accepted them discreetly. Chloe didn't ask if Mrs. Ann had left anything for her mother. It was probably already known. Chloe also didn't talk about her new hobby. And Mia didn't ask if her daughter was coming this summer, or if she would ever come at all. They said goodbye as strangers. Immediately after his wife's funeral, Michael went into rehab. He knew that otherwise he would lose his inheritance. But Mia wasn't sure of anything. Every treatment comes to an end sooner or later. Michael will be discharged. He will start hanging around the house again and looking for entertainment. There was no doubt he would eventually find some. Mia had a pretty good idea what kind. And with the money her landlady left her, Mia bought a house in the village, a big old house, a former manor house. She talked to drug addicts and found a few people who had quit and hoped to stay in that state as long as possible, preferably for the rest of their lives. Mia talked to each one and put together a team. She also found a woman named Jill. Outwardly, she was nothing special, a thin, petite, middle-aged blonde. But Jill had been working with people like that for a long time, and also Mia had never seen such a thing before. But on the example of her new acquaintance, she realized it was true. There are vampire people who naturally drink strength from you. Once you've been with one of those people, you leave like a squeezed lemon. And Jill radiated energy, gave it away generously, and everyone was always drawn to her. The women had a long conversation, clarified the nuances. The estate was far from the city. You could get to it by the only road. Every person was noticeable. If someone decides to remember old things, you can't bring anything here unnoticed. It would take everyone who settled in the manor to be engaged in healthy physical work. They're not bad people. And then everything should work out from there. Of course, you can't force anyone. And to live in such a commune or not is a voluntary matter. But someone will probably stay there for a long time. They'll have a vegetable garden, some animals. And Michael will always, every minute, be in front of Mia. 3 years. And both he and Mia will be free. He would get his money, and she would be free of the obligation to look after him. Mia caught herself reasoning already as a single person, thinking about what she would do when it was all over, and she would return to her parents' empty home, the ancestral nest, and calculate her pension so that it would be enough for everything, and probably sign up for the library. That's the way it would turn out one day. The old house was taking on a new life. It could be a museum, if someone had the will and the money, and if there were enough people to come and see the life of a 19th century landowner. Not a great poet, not a famous musician, but an ordinary man who loved his home and his fields. Mia stood on the first floor in the bay-windowed room she had chosen for herself. She looked out of the window and thought that the landowner must have had an office here, and he too looked out at the river meters away, at the willows leaning against the water, at the meadows. They were blooming now, and sweet to his heart. Mia had never allowed herself to be idle before. There was always something for her hands to do. But now Chloe, who had enough energy for two, was sure to take over. Jill enjoyed her new job, immersed in it with her head. She was the one who told Mia about the new residents of their little commune. And she had a kind word for everyone. Greg had worked all his life in the north, widowed, and thought he would live with his son's family and grandchildren. But his daughter-in-law first persuaded him to sell his northern shares and give them the money for a new car and repairs. Then she got him out of the flat and made him practically homeless. That's when Greg started drinking. Jill picked him up at some shelter. Then there's Tyler, a talented bard. He used to do a lot of gigs traveling, and afterwards, artists get a treat. At some point, Tyler realized he was losing his humanity. The tour was over. Even for himself, on his favorite guitar he couldn't play. His fingers refused to obey. Tyler was in drug treatment. Jill picked him up right after he got out. Brandon could have grown up to be a good kid kind, no matter what. But his mom brought in his stepdad, who drank and got his stepson hooked. Jill told these bitter stories with genuine pity for her charges. She wanted to protect the weak in spirit, to help them. Mia, on the other hand, had shunned such people all her long life. She didn't want to take on the burden of caring for them. Only now she began to look at those whom she called bottom dwellers, and thought that they would never get out of there. One day Mia told her friend about her own fate and asked with a chuckle, "You would probably feel sorry for my husband and invite him to live here, wouldn't you?" Jill thought for a few seconds and said, "No. If he abandoned his newborn daughter, did not even remember her, it is already hopeless. She wouldn't call, and if she came, she'd kick him out." Jill confirmed her words by breaking up with one of the tenants. Asking to take him to the village with her, Kyle swore that he was done with the bottle. A week later, Jill, returning from the shop, saw Kyle in the company of a local alcoholic. Both were quite pleased with the familiarity and companionship. When Jill told Kyle to pack his things in the morning, he tried to appeal to her pity. "Where am I going to go? I'm just going to sleep under a fence." "Go to someone you know." Jill cut him off. "His house is a wreck, but you'll fit in somehow. Don't doubt that alcoholic will welcome you with open arms. You'll be digging people's gardens, selling bottles. It's all right. You'll make a living." Mia, on the other hand, enjoyed the silence. And it wasn't just nature. There is no such thing as absolute silence in nature. At night, Mia woke up and took her time to go back to sleep. The window was open, and she listened to the nightingale singing, to the sound of a choir nearby. For the first time, she had the energy and time to do something other than continuous labor. When the foreman was called and he was installing a speaker in the house, Mia asked him what there was to see nearby. And the foreman, an old-timer of the area, began to tell her about the surrounding forests and lakes, where it is better to pick mushrooms, where to fish, and where it is better not to go. You might meet wild boars or accidentally step on an adder. You should talk to our forester. He would tell you so much, finished the master. He says that there are a lot of abnormal places here. True, he lives far away, on the cordon, but often comes to the forestry. Mia already knew where the forestry was. Not far from the center of the village there is a house under a roof, surrounded by old pine trees. The house is surrounded by a blank fence, on which someone had written graffiti "Animals are not food," and someone also crossed it out the next day with a bold cross. The woodsman's name is Will. Talk to him. Really, no one knows more about the area than he does. The first years of study at the Institute, Chloe was so fascinated by New York that she forgot about everything in the world. She told her friends and herself that she would never come home again, that here is her soul, her life. She even had the same pulse with New York. She couldn't believe herself that she hardly missed her mother at all. Student life, with so many interesting things to do, had swept over her head. And then, when Michael began to come, she didn't tell her mother about it, but she left the hostel just then and rented a flat on the outskirts of the city. But here it was far to get to the Institute, spent 2 hours on the way. And the girl moved closer to the center to a room in a communal flat. Michael gave money for everything, even for Chloe's mobile phone. The girl was really in love with him. Here he remained the last thread linking her to the house. But often come Michael could not, and gradually for Chloe his image lost clarity, became pale in comparison with her new acquaintances. So she befriended an artist who once in Central Park painted her portrait. He was Chloe's age. He had lived in New York all his life, and he showed the girl such places that she would not have discovered without him. The artist organized excursions on the rooftops, took Chloe to some bohemian bars, told her where Masons once gathered in New York. She told her friends that with him madly interesting, and she wanted to become like him, unusual, bright. She dyed her hair red. She got tattoos from her hands to her shoulders at the salon. She told Michael not to come again, and to make it look thorough, remembering his dying wife, whom she had never thought of before. She knew that this was a real grief for Michael, that it was easier for him to feel like a wretch and torn between Mrs. Ann and her than to lose her, Chloe, forever. Chloe then fell ill with the very disease that the world either believes in or doesn't. The doctors said it wasn't that severe, that her young body could handle it. But Chloe did not turn to the doctors. She was lying in her room under the roof, and she had no strength to get out of bed. The sun did not look at her. The window looked out on the north side, a dull backyard, and Chloe had to look at the ceiling, count the cracks on it, and think that sometime before her this room lived. Probably the same poor student, or maybe a small clerk, a character of Edgar Poe. And he did not have enough money even for tea and sugar. The thoughts of tea were pressing. At first, Chloe didn't feel like eating at all. But when she began to recover, it turned out that there was not a crumb left in the house, and the girl could only get from the bed to the chair, sit for a while at the window, and drenched in sweat from weakness, back to bed. The painter did not come, afraid of the infection. In the end, Chloe was helped out by a neighbor, an old woman, God's dandelion. From time to time she went to the city, stood somewhere near the bridge and read by heart poetry classics. It was a way to supplement her pension. And also the old woman understood everything without words. She noticed that Chloe does not go anywhere, only to the toilet. So she made a judgment call. She crept to the door. Chloe opened it. "Little girl," said the old lady, "I'm going to the shop. Don't you need anything?" Chloe asked for tea, sugar, and a bun. She wanted to hug the old woman, but she was afraid to make her sick. The room was cold. Chloe drank hot tea, wrapped in a blanket. She wanted to go home for the first time. Mia decided to go to the distant lake they had just told her about. Everyone found something different there. Some people found beautiful views for photographs. Some people found scatterings of forest strawberries. Some people found solitude, a ringing silence. Going alone and orientated only on a satellite map was a bit scary. But Jill and her helpers were passionately engaged in the vegetable garden. It was a sin to distract her from such happiness. Mia walked through the meadow, which was in full bloom, across the bridge on its warm wooden planks. Beyond that was a road of concrete slabs, paved for who knows when and why. The grass was already thick between the slabs, and sometimes the concrete was lost in it. Mia was reminded of The Road to Nowhere, a book by Alexander Green that she had read as a child. Mia knew that she had gone far away from people already, and she didn't want to meet anyone, neither man nor beast. Because who could be more defenseless? An old woman who didn't even have a stick in her hand. And when she heard dry, like distant gunshots, sounds behind her, she turned round hurriedly. A rider was traveling along the same road, a man on a tall, naked horse. Mia hurriedly stepped to the side, giving way to him, but the stranger pulled on the reins and asked her, "Are you all right? Are you not lost?" She shrugged her shoulders. How can one get lost out here? She turned round tiredly and walked along the same slabs. There's only an abandoned village about 5 kilometers ahead. You're going that way, aren't you? Excuse me, but who are you to ask questions? He seemed surprised that he wasn't known. I'm going back home to the cordon. I'm the ranger here, Will. Mia nodded. I've been told about you. I even wanted to look you up if I could. Said no one knows the area better than you. Did you just move here? They walked side by side. Will was in a hurry and led the horse. Mia asked him what there was to see in the neighborhood. What's there to see? He answered her question with a question. The people here already know everything, and among the holiday makers there are more often amateur fishermen. They should first of all find out what and where they catch, and whether it is far from the lake, and whether it is possible to get there by car, and show on the map whether there are snakes there. And the most interesting thing is to tell children. Why? Will said. Because they just believe. They believe what I believe. It's a legendary land, really. They've even tried to explain it all scientifically. And what have you seen? Will glanced at her, as if checking to see if she was going to laugh. Sometimes there are paintings in the sky. The clouds get up like that, and the colors show up like that. So you look, and there's a bud above you. It's like a fantastic landscape. Another planet with purple seas, blue mountains and crimson rocks, like a mirage. And for a long time it stands there, doesn't move, doesn't disappear. Then I drop everything and look. There are caves here, connected by underground passages. They say they used to be home to bandits who robbed traveling merchants. There are some guys who climb these passages. They're hoping to find the treasure. They get lost and then I have to get them out. And then there's Soul Lake. It's like a small lake, and I don't show you the way to it, but only if you look into it. And it's not you reflected in the water, but your soul. Not always, but it happens. At some point in the conversation, Mia realized that she had long ago missed the turn to Lake Bright, which she had hoped to see. She stopped and gave Will her hand. "If you're ever going to walk this far again," he said to her, "come and see me at the cordon, and I'll tell you lots of other stories." Mia was used to the fact that here in the village a complete stranger might say hello to her in the street, and after a while there would be no strangers left. You go to the shop and you're bound to meet a dozen neighbors on the way. Now she began to meet Will. He came to the forestry farm several times a week, went on his motorbike, went on his horse, whose name was King. Will said he had no intention of getting a horse. But King's fate was too hard. His previous owners had kept him starved, beaten him with logs, and finally wanted to give him to the butchers. I said to them, "How much will you get for him?" "Skin and bones." "Sell him to me," so I bought him back. The horse was short-sighted back then, afraid of everything. You'd approach him, and he'd flee. He calmed down a bit at my cordon. We're friends now. But he'll never be the same again, trusting as he was. Will asked Mia to visit, and she did visit him at the cordon. It was a steep hike up a forested mountain. The two of them walked together, and Will kept Mia distracted from the hardships of the journey with conversation. But she still had to stop several times to catch her breath and gather her strength. Then the woods parted, revealing a sunlit clearing. Small birch trees grew there like grass, and there were lots of flowers. Mia felt ashamed that she knew the name of only a few of them, for these were her native places. And when she saw scatterings of wild strawberries, she couldn't resist picking them as she had done when she was a child, putting them in an improvised palm made of a fern leaf. Will's house was a big log house. Nearby, laundry dried on a rope and goats roamed. "I get a lot of visitors in the summer," Will said, "especially young guys who are interested in the paranormal. How many times they've told me that they lost their way, that their watch stopped on the way, that they walked and walked and walked, and came to a place they never expected to be. How do you feel about that?" "I've seen too much myself to laugh at them." "What do you do in the winter?" "I have a snowmobile. There's a village nearby where summer cottagers come in the summer, and in the winter, it's just old ladies. And if a grandmother gets sick, they put her in a big trough, hitch it to the snowmobile, and take her to the district center, where there is a hospital. They drank tea with herbs and fragrant honey. Mia realized that Will was spending too much time with her. No one would just treat a newcomer to the village like that. But she'd long ago stopped thinking of herself as a woman to look up to. A maid aunt she had read from someone about the wonderful phenomenon of aunts these, waving to themselves, are individuals characterized by total self-denial cleaning, lugging heavy bags from the shop, cooking, feeding everyone, and all for others. These ridiculous aunts, most often overweight, with short boyish haircuts that don't suit them, with wrinkles formed by a stern expression on their faces. And you won't be stern here in the fight against life. These aunts are the salt of the earth. They provide sustenance so that others can create, dream, and fulfill their dreams. Mia thought of herself as one of those aunts, and she thought that there was only one thing ahead of her old age, which it would be good to keep on her own feet, so as not to be a burden to people. And now Will calls her to come more often and walks her home, and brings gifts different from what Ben used to bring. A tincture to rub on her tired shoulders. Too much of her life had been on those shoulders, and the pain would go away in a flash. Or a berry patch. "I'll come round," Mia promised in surprise. Jill was deservedly proud of herself. She was finding work for her charges, and now they didn't have to sit on anyone's back. Surprisingly, there was an ostrich farm in this small village on the outskirts of the town, and Jill had placed some people to look after the huge birds. Jill knew that her charges had settled in the old house for good, that the lineup would change as well. But they needed a break from their old, unsettled, pain-filled lives. "We're having a labor and recreation camp here," Jill was saying. Mia had secretly feared when she'd brought Michael out here that he wouldn't last long. All that gardening wasn't for his fine hands. To her surprise, he never once asked to come back and kept himself busy, cutting grass, gathering wood for the bath. Surely he needed to feel that deadly fatigue by evening. It drove the thoughts away. And yes, Jill was right. The fatigue drowned out the pain. And then Michael arrived at Jill's house. Unlike himself, he was glowing. "Chloe called me," Michael said. "She's coming, wants to spend the rest of the summer here." Mia, who had not been informed of her plans by her daughter, was cautious about the news. So what? Maybe she'll come with a friend of hers? With this artist, they had long since parted. Chloe said that she missed me, asking me to come. Mia saw that Michael was ready to go to the city, despite the terms of the will, according to which he was obliged to obey her. "Go," she said. "Tell your daughter I love her, and I'm always waiting for her." The day after Michael left, Mia went to visit Will. She didn't warn him of her visit and went alone. It was okay if she didn't catch the woodsman at home. She would wait for him. And yet, how is he not afraid to live so far away from people? If something happens, how can he explain to the ambulance where to go? And would a car get there on these trails? Immersed in her own thoughts, Mia didn't realize whether she was going the right way. Had she lost her way? Then she definitely woke up. The forest surrounded her, and there seemed to be grass mown and some semblance of a path looping around. Scolding herself with the last words who would look for her now. The fool. Mia followed the trail and suddenly froze when a small lake opened up in front of her. Its banks were thickly overgrown and, by the looks of it, marshy. It was only possible to approach the water to where she now stood. At the very edge of the water lay a flat, large rock. Mia was hot, and she wanted to dip her hands into the water and then rub her face with them, which were cold. So she stepped onto the rock and leaned out into the lake and froze. The water was very dark, almost black, and it reflected everything: the sky with its high cumulus clouds, the tops of the trees, and Mia herself. Only it was not a tired middle-aged woman, but a young girl, a lush braid the color of ripe rye hanging over her shoulder, a clear oval face. It was the way she had once been and still was in old photographs, and beautiful, large, and a little frightened eyes. The girl reflected in the water was a beauty. Life had not yet turned her into a fiery horse, had not tormented her with deceit and disappointments. This girl believed in goodness and waited for love. For a long time, Mia looked at her own reflection. Gradually, she began to identify herself with the one who at first seemed a stranger to her. It seemed to her that even the expression on the girl's face was changing. Mia was wrong. Life looked at her from the dark water with the eyes of the one who had withstood everything, who had not broken, and who still had the same eyes full of inner light. And she became even more beautiful. "We have a lake here, and if you look into it, you'll see your soul," Mia remembered Will's words. So it was her soul, then. She plunged her hands into the water, either trying to touch the girl or hoping the magical water would heal her fatigue. The hands of Mia and the one reflected made contact. And Mia remembered that long-forgotten feeling of youth, when life seems like a miracle. And that miracle belongs to you, and you can handle anything. You own the whole world. When Mia walked away from the lake, she somehow immediately came to the right path that led to the cordon. But there was still a long way to go. She walked on, picking flowers. They weren't pretty, but they smelled so strongly of honey that they made her dizzy. She came to Will's house with a large bouquet. No one was at the cordon, but it looked as if the owner had been away for a while and would be back soon. On the kitchen table was a plate of chunks of fish and flour. Mia lit the cooker, put on a frying pan, and began to fry the fish. The fins were turning golden, and the crispy pieces were covered with a smoky crust. What a marvelous aroma. Will returned to the cordon with a strange feeling that someone was there. He had lived alone for many years. A long time ago he had been married, but the marriage hadn't lasted a few years. Olivia couldn't stand living in the middle of nowhere. She wanted to go back to the city. Maybe if she found the right words, he'd drop everything. But Olivia put up with it for a long time, and then she made a scene, calling him a recluse and a loser. She packed her things and told Will she wouldn't come back, even if he crawled to town on his knees. From then on, only brave tourists who were not afraid to climb into the heart of these woods came to his cordon. The feeling that someone was here was growing stronger, even though the front lawn was empty. Will hurriedly stepped onto the porch and opened the door. Mia paced barefoot in the kitchen, humming and frying fish.